For the counselors just joining us, you do have to log on tonight like it's a regular meeting instead of a we have IT to help you. Is it okay if we just sort of get started? Okay. Okay. Welcome, everyone. It is June 6th, 2022, and it is our study session for this evening. Are there any reports from, oh, I guess I'm first. I forget. I have a long list. Last week we had NATA meeting and just want to remind everybody, Bike to Work Day is June 22nd. Rich Seymour and Councilor Seymour and myself met with folks about the National Lao Hmong Monument and with Parks and Rec folks. So had some discussion, and we'll be having more. We had a ribbon cutting at Legacy Dentists, and I don't know if anybody's here from community development, but they want to be involved in the community and know how they can help. So I passed that along. Fall Aerospace was last week, and it was a fantastic tour. They showed us their aerospace area and where people have ideas. You take those ideas, see how they will manufacture out and times and everything, and they keep refining it till it gets into a new product. And got to see some of the areas that they are working on specialized aerospace pieces. And I shared with them, I thought they should offer to call every cell phone tower operator in the city and use their antennas for the phone antennas so that we had service on 144th, on Huron, and 112th. So they laughed. They said they'd never probably get a call from those people. We then all had a reception for fire chief candidate, the final list for the fire chief candidates, and that was great to get to meet everybody. I saw Councillor Seymour on the quarterly Jeffco Cities and Commissioners meeting. And if there was anything, I had to jump off because I had another meeting at 9. And we had the Heritage Grand Opening at 100th and Old Wadsworth. I had a meeting with HUD. They had a tour of Alto, a press conference, and a roundtable. That was 3 hours. And probably the big thing that I came away from that whole piece is we need homes, and that's homes defined in every way possible at all price points. Affordable just doesn't cut it. We just need all price points. And so you'll never probably hear me talk about affordable housing because it's very clear we need price points so that all can have the opportunity to live somewhere. We had the 73rd Street and Lowell, between Lowell and Bradburn block party on Friday night. All I can say to Parks and Rec was it was the best ever. Great comments are still coming in. Intergenerational, people new down there that are excited about learning about their new home. And we were in the Grange. I was in the Grange helping a historical society, and people wanted to know what history was on their house and everything. It was terrific. Westminster Fire Department had an event up at the Orchard on Saturday while some of you were drinking beer. And I was in the duck tank helping raise money for the burn fund for the fire department. And last night, Bradburn neighbors, there were about 35 gathered for a potluck. They had 2 police officers. I also attended. Some of other council members were invited but couldn't attend. It was fantastic. And here's just a few of the questions. And Jody, I'll make sure you get a full list. Boating and camping at Stanley Lake. Are we, can we, and when will we? Jacob had great ideas about sustainability with food and asked where to find info on planting in this area and how to plant properly. And the same about canning and freezing. He has turned his whole yard into a farm. Literally, he's got things planted that should sustain his family for the year. He's even has a small orchard in his backyard with 3 kinds of fruit trees, and he's alternated them. It was fascinating to listen to, but he's looking for help. And that brought up another person that's down there that has had the forester from Parks and Rec out and helping with how to plant trees. And from listening to their story, I think we all put too rich of soil in with them because that is not the soil they're going to live in. And they even dug up a dead tree, and it still was like the ball that they originally got. And when it was alive, it just kept growing inside that ball. It didn't go out into the rich soil. So what all of that brought up was how do we zero-scape? We're told we should, but there's nothing from the city of how to do it properly. There's ditch water down there that someone came by and bought out water rights from these citizens, and now They're just wondering who's in charge of trees in these ditches and just general cleanup of it. Many questions about graffiti, stolen cars, crime, and the officers spent 2 hours sharing. The police app was shared with everybody and shown how to use it and how to notify the city on homeless camps now. That's on that app. So it is truly a one-stop app, and I love it because when I'm driving and see the graffiti, it's just easier to press that button and hands-free be able to report it instead of remember where I saw it. They talked about some other cities, what they are doing to not encourage camping on their grounds and setups, and some where they don't allow structures like pop-up tents or any kind of tents. You would have to get a special permit if you were wanting to use that in one of their parks. And can we talk to the railroad and get help or an okay to do something along our railroad tracks that have camps that are growing and the human waste is going to make people sick. So that has been my last 10 days. Anyone else?
Excuse me. Thank you, Mayor. I had some of the same things you did, but a couple things I wanted to point out. I did have the board meeting for the Butterfly Pavilion, as well as I met with Patrick for breakfast. So a couple things on that. The attendance there is going really well. They actually said that it's the best that it's been. So they're doing a very good rebound after COVID. I know that that was very hard on them, and there was even a point where they did have to actually lay off staff, but it sounds like they've brought most of them back if they were still able or available to work. Some of the stuff that I talked to Patrick about, I do have with Jody, and Jody and I are going to meet to talk more in depth, but it's clear as they continue their capital campaign to be able to move to their new location in Broomfield and build that out, we as a city and a council need to understand that IGA much better, so we understand from our perspective, what's owed to us or owed to them. But I also, and this is part of what I talked to Patrick about, I think, in my opinion, and I hope you all agree, that I think it's fair that the city works with them to make sure that we all are working on the same plane as far as what that IGA says and what the exit strategy is available for them, because they're talking to staff members on our side versus talking to Patrick. It seems like there's not a connect as far as what each party thinks that title and IGA says. So I think that it would make sense if we could get educated on that, because at the end of the day, my perspective is that was a council action that created that IGA, and so council certainly should have a say in how we move forward and continue to be good partners, because I am of the mindset, even though they may leave the city and that's their plan, I still think that it's a benefit to the metro area, and they've been good partners to us, and we should maintain that partnership. So I look forward to working with the council and staff on how we work with them as partners to move forward. A couple other things. I also attended the reception for the finalists for the fire chief. The only thing I say is I'm very happy to see we have 5 great candidates that are being vetted to potentially be the next chief. The other 2 things I went to the block party. Kudos to the staff. That was, and as well as the community. Fantastic event. Very well attended. Lots of first responders out there as well. So I appreciate both the police and fire who showed up to spend time with the community. And then last but not least, the reason the mayor said we were drinking beer is because Councilor Seymour, Emmons, and myself went to the official kickoff of Run Westy Run, which is off of 70th and Hooker. And I think they're open every day except for Monday. I think it's 5 to 8 on weekdays. Saturday and Sunday, it's like 12 to 8 or 12 to 9. But great beer that we did get to have. We got to be able to kick them off, and I got to pour the first beer. And so since I poured it, I felt that I should drink it, and I did. So it was a great event, though. A very, very neat concept, and I hope that it really does help activate the area down there. And so kudos to both staff and the entrepreneurs who came up with the idea to make that come to life. So I would appreciate if people go check them out.
The only other thing I have to report is our weekly update on city manager search. And we have 3 more days, but will be 25 to 30 names for us. And so we aren't extending. They feel they have a good pool. And as of sometime Wednesday, we'll probably hear more. And they'll get to work then to do the background checks and start looking at what they bring forward to us. So just wanted to alert everybody on that. First agenda item tonight, Rocky Flats. Who's up? Oh, I'm sorry, city manager. You have anything? Are you working over there?
Everything's working. Thank
Okay.
you. And as staff prepare for the first item, I just have a couple of brief updates. The first one regarding tonight's agenda, we will not be seeking an executive session tonight. That's a title that we have every Monday regarding our collective bargaining with our police. And I can report that we have begun collective bargaining with our police officers through the FOP, and we've received their first offer, and we are reviewing that. We'll be going through that with them on Thursday, and that'll position us well for an executive session with City Council on the coming Monday, June 13th, where we will brief council and then receive direction moving forward in those negotiations. So it's a process update tonight for you and our public. The second is I would reiterate, we did conclude the formal part of our fire chief recruitment process at the end of last week. We had an outstanding response nationally to that recruitment. We did have 5 finalists come in, and thank you for participating in one of our panels to greet those candidates. And we are now moving through the final stages to ultimately select a new fire chief for the city of Westminster. I would just say, again, an outstanding pool of 5 national and internal candidates in that competition. I would also just note for my third point tonight that next week marks the launch on June 15th of our Civic Academy for 2022. And that is the night, that's Wednesday night, and that is the night that City Council greets our students and participants in the Civic Academy. So I wanted to flag that for those of you who are following that. We have 17 participants this year for the 2022 session. So it would be a very well-attended session. That's all I have tonight, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you get to sit down. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so Mayor Pro Tem and City Council, thank you so much for having us tonight. My name is Priya. I'm a water quality chemist, and this is Joe Rielli, and he's an open space superintendent. And we're going to kind of tag team this presentation.
We're getting feedback.
Oh. Does it still give you the feedback? How's that? Is that better? Okay. All right. So sorry, let me back up. I'm Trina Nance, water quality chemist, and this is Joe Rielli, open space superintendent, and we're going to tag team this presentation tonight. And so just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to give you a brief overview, and it's going to be very brief, of Rocky Flats site and the history. We'll talk a little bit about residual offsite contamination and how we protect Stanley Lake. We'll go into a little bit about the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council, talk a little bit about staff activities, and give you some updates on that. And then Joe will give you some information on the wildlife refuge trails and greenway trails. And just so you know, I really like to have a conversational presentation, so please feel free to interrupt with questions as they come up. This is a lot of information to give in one presentation, and it's very high level. So if there's anything you want to dig into a little deeper, we can. And there is a lot of information out there, so I might not be able to answer all of your questions, but I do know where to find the information. So keep that in mind as we move through this. So we'll start out talking about the Rocky Flats location and the mission. As you know, the Rocky Flats site is located directly west of Westminster. It is delineated into 2 units, the central operable unit and the peripheral operable unit, which is known now as the Wildlife Refuge. The Wildlife Refuge or peripheral operable unit was the buffer zone for the for the central operable unit where all of the site activities occurred. And the mission of the Rocky Flats site was to produce nuclear and non-nuclear weapons. The most hazardous products were a result of the plutonium triggers, which were these little plutonium discs. They're kind of called plutonium buttons. And those were used to trigger nuclear weapons. Additionally, so the hazardous products that became of this were the plutonium the plutonium from the pits and depleted uranium. The timeline leading up to the cleanup and closure, operations began in 1952, and processing of plutonium triggers began in 1953. Several contamination events occurred. These included manufacturing fires and a series of waste drums that were stored improperly, and those ended up leaking into the soil. There were also accidental releases. These all occurred from the 1950s through the 1970s. And these are believed to be the primary sources of the off-site contamination that we will talk about later today. The FBI and EPA raided the site in 1989 due to environmental crimes, and subsequently the site was placed on the Superfund cleanup list. Nuclear weapons production was halted in 1992 with the cessation of the Cold War, and the full cleanup mission began in 1994 and was completed in 2006. So I added these photos here just to kind of give you some context. We have the 903 pad on the left, and that is where all of the barrels were stored and open to the elements. Oh, sorry. I keep backing away from it. Oh, you don't see pictures?
No.
Oh, sorry. Next slide, please. I'm just carrying on my computer.
Okay, we have them.
Okay. So on your left is the 903 pad where all of the barrels were stored. These were open to the elements, and ultimately the barrels leaked because, Colorado weather, we get a lot of precipitation, we get a lot of wind. The barrels leaked into the soil and contaminated the soil, and many of these barrels had plutonium in the barrels, which caused there to be plutonium in the soil. So that will be a really important thing to remember later, because this is the most important site for off-site contamination and is estimated to be the main source. In the middle, we have a Rocky Flats site worker working, and he's working in a glove box. So the way that they would work on plutonium is to put their hands into these gloves in a box and work on the plutonium there. So that was supposed to create a barrier between them and the plutonium. On the far right, you can kind of see the glove boxes stacked together and a woman working in a glove box with her hands in there. Now that you have a very brief overview of the Rocky Flats contamination and history, we'll go over residual offsite contamination. And it should be noted that there are small amounts of residual above background contamination. These are within 2 to 3 miles of the Rocky Flats site. Risk assessments have been performed by both DOE and a citizen environmental sampling committee, and they deem that all of this offsite risk is low. The reason that the citizen environmental sampling committee occurred is because after DOE did their risk assessment, there were citizens that were a little skeptical of this. So they decided, or CDPHE actually put together a citizen environmental sampling committee, and they concurred with the results that DOE had. And Councilor Baker, I know that you requested, I have it right here. You requested the Cray-Hardy map. Is this the correct one? So one thing to note about the Cray-Hardy map is this was a good study that was performed in the 1970s, and it was the first effort to characterize off-site contamination from the Rocky Flats site. Subsequent studies have shown that that study wasn't exactly reliable, and this was because of low sample size and different sampling techniques used back then. So in the 1990s, they did another study.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you just said. Would you say it again? You said that it was unreliable, but I didn't understand the reason.
Yes, so it was because of low sample size low sample size. There was only about 30 samples used in the first study by Cray and Hardy. And then the second study was about 20 samples. So this was a pretty low sample size and they were really close together. And additionally, you know, as science progresses, you find better ways and better methods to doing things. So the sampling design and the analyses weren't as accurate. So when they did the study in the 1990s, they found that they actually did 750 samples and found that that was not a reliable study, and that so they found it wasn't a reliable study, and it kind of boosted a few, like it led into a few more additional studies, like the Citizen Environmental Sampling Committee was another study that concurred with this 1995 study. And then in 2011, there was also another study done by the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, funded by them, and it was done along Indiana Street. And it actually concurred with the contours that were developed in 1995. Does that answer your question?
Hey, quick question. if I
Yeah.
may. In that last study with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice, how many samples did they use for that?
Let me see here. You know, I would have to get back to you on that. I don't actually have that off the top of my head in my notes.
The thought is considerably more than the 20 or 30 that were run in the first couple.
That's the thought, that I cannot guarantee
Okay.
that, but they did, like the point I was trying to make there is that they concur with the contours that were developed in the 1995 study.
Thank you.
And as you,
Sorry, quick question.
oh yeah,
And that might be, you may be getting to this on the third bullet, but how often is it tested?
oh, so these were studies that were done historically. So 1970 was the first study, like the Cray-Hardy study, and then Latour was done in 1995. And then there were Citizens Environmental Sampling Study, as well as the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, the most recent in 2011. And then there has been additional studies associated with the Jefferson Parkway and the refuge trails. So
Okay, thanks.
any other questions before I move on? As you can see in the contour, there is a dashed line. This indicates the 0.8 picocuries per gram contour line. And as you can see, Stanley Lake is in this contour. In addition to the offsite studies that have been performed, Stanley Lake has actually been extensively studied as well. There were studies performed by the USGS back in the 1990s. And what they did was they took sediment cores at the bottom of Stanley Lake. And these determined that the contamination is buried under 18 inches of soil. So what a sediment core looks like, they're gonna, like, it's just a tube. And then they section it and they figure out where that plutonium is laying. And that's where they found that 18 inches were above the contamination. Keep in mind that this was a 1992 study. So 30 years ago, there's going to be probably about 18 more inches plus of sediment on top of this contamination. So any contamination that is in Stanley Lake is very buried and not going to move through the sediment. Additionally, any studies on the water in Stanley Lake have shown that it is safe for drinking. There's never been an issue there, and there's never been an exceedance of safe drinking water standards in Stanley Lake.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So the 18 inches, what's the, how do we know that that's low? Or so is that a lot
Yeah.
for this type of thing? Or is that, what's the benchmark on that?
So, you know, I don't know if there's specifically a benchmark on the amount of sediment that would be ideal, but in the way that plutonium moves, it typically will move with sediment. And in the bottom of a reservoir, that sediment that's underneath, like that's buried under 18 inches of sediment, isn't going to move. It would have to be really perturbed or disturbed in some way for that to move. And even so, because plutonium tends to be, or at least the plutonium found out at Rocky Flats tends to be attached to particulates, it would settle back out. So it's not moving and it won't move unless something disturbs it.
I also think it's important to note here that plutonium and the other radioactive isotopes do not solubilize in water. There are some metals that do, like sodium chloride will dissolve in water. Calcium, magnesium, even iron. The radioactive ones don't. So we don't have to worry about them ending up in the drinking water, and they have this top cover of sediment on top of them.
That is correct. Thank you, Councilor Baker.
Just another question.
Yeah.
So in the Stanley Lake area, is there any, I remember at some point there was some desire to put an oil and gas well there for a very hot minute. Is there any conflict with the location of the contamination and any potential drilling?
Specifically with Stanley Lake, I don't believe there is. In regards to contamination, obviously, if that were to happen again, there would be a lot of statements in opposition. We don't want drilling to occur under Stanley Lake. And I do touch upon this a little bit later in the presentation.
Could real quickly,
Yeah.
since it was brought up, didn't we take action on that to make sure that doesn't ever happen?
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem, we did. So the city adopted oil and gas regulations last year, and those regulations limit the potential for any development anywhere near Stanley Lake and occupied areas of the city. So yes, short answer. Though there was some interest prior to the city's updated oil and gas regulations, now with those regulations in place, it would not be possible to develop on shores of the lake.
Thank you, because being on council at that point, I know that that was a big concern when that came up, and I knew we took action. So I appreciate you refreshing my memory.
And just to add to that, at the same time, there was an oil and gas proposition to drill underneath Rocky Flats itself. And the Stewardship Council did write a letter in opposition to this. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So now that we know kind of an idea of the offsite contamination, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we protect Stanley Lake. So the DOE has to meet stringent standards for surface water leaving the site. There are 2 continuous surface water monitoring locations that are considered the points of compliance, and these are located on Woman Creek and Walnut Creek. To prevent any water that potentially, comes off, or just to elaborate further on the points of compliance. If there is an exceedance of the surface water standard at these points of compliance, it triggers a number of things with CDPHE and reports, and essentially it creates a lot of work and problems for DOE if this were to occur. The point of compliance at Woman Creek is the one that we're particularly interested in because Woman Creek formerly used to run into Stanley Lake. Woman Creek Reservoir, which was built in 1995, prevents water that is coming off of the site, regardless of, if it has exceeded the point of compliance. Just any water that comes off of the site goes into Woman Creek Reservoir, and it is pumped away and up into Walnut Creek. So any water leaving the Rocky Flats site does not enter Stanley Lake. Additionally, we have the church ditch. The church ditch is one of the 4 conveyances that delivers water to Stanley Lake. And in 2009, the entrance to Stanley Lake, the entrance for the water to Stanley Lake was moved to the southwestern side of the lake. So water will come into Stanley Lake prior to going anywhere near Woman Creek. So if any water from Woman Creek happened to get into the church ditch, it wouldn't go into Stanley Lake. It would just be routed around Stanley Lake. So there are multiple protections in place that ensure that Stanley Lake doesn't get any water from the Rocky Flats site. So we are well protected there. Going into the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council, this is a big gear shift change, but so the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council was formed in 2006. It consists of 14 members of communities and governments, and it provides a local platform, or a platform for local engagement. And what I mean by this is it brings the governments together and members of different communities and allows them to kind of move towards a common interest. It also is a mechanism to maintain public knowledge, which means, if we don't consistently have a platform for thinking about Rocky Flats, it could be forgotten about. So it's a good way to keep it in front of each of the government's minds. And, any sort of things that are going on with DOE, you're made aware of, and any exceedances that occur, they're in the forefront of your mind. Ways that the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council has helped out in the past is there was a DOE essentially back in 2011 wanted to breach 3 terminal dams on the central operable unit. And these 3 dams are the last place that you can stop water from leaving the site. And their argument to breach these dams was they hadn't seen any reason to need to stop the water. However, the communities that are involved in the Stewardship Council disagreed with this, and this
Vehemently disagreed with
Yeah.
them.
Yes. And this allowed basically the formation of the adaptive management plan, which allows for more data collection and addresses uncertainty with breaching these dams. And the Stewardship Council backed us in this and made sure that they wrote a letter, standing by us and agreeing that this was the right move. And another thing that the Stewardship Council has done, we already touched upon this, was the oil and gas. They wrote a letter of opposition of oil and gas that would be any oil and gas drilling directly under the Rocky Flats site. And this benefited Westminster in that it, we're a downstream community. Obviously, anything that's happening up there is going to affect us. And it also benefited the Woman Creek Reservoir Authority, keeping them safe. So yeah, these meetings are held 5 times per year. They include updates from DOE and legacy management. 4 of these 5 meetings have updates on the annual report and the quarterly reports. So it's a way to get that data in front of us and make sure that we're aware of anything that's happening out there. Going into staff activities. So staff collaborate with Thornton, North Glen, and Broomfield, and we provide technical comments to DOE and as well as participate in technical meetings. The 4 cities are known as the downstream communities. And we recently commented on updates to the Surface Water Adaptive Management Plan, which I mentioned before is directly related to the data collection for the dam breach. They review this every 2 years, and the cities are given an opportunity to comment on this and indicate if they want to see more sampling or if there's any areas that they feel that DOE is not addressing. Additionally, we also commented on the upcoming CERCLA 5-year review, and CERCLA stands for Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. So every 5 years, DOE has to look at all the data that they have collected and evaluate on whether the remedy or the cleanup activities that occurred out there remains protective of public health and the environment. And they request public comment well before they actually write the document, which is unfortunate. So in December of 2021, we submitted comments, like the downstream communities got together. We reviewed the data and let DOE know what we would like to see in this 5-year review and issues that we think need to be addressed. Finally, one of the current issues that I've been working on very closely is surface water location. Oh, sorry, next slide. Okay. So yeah, one of the current issues I've been working on is surface water location SW027. It has had multiple reportable conditions for plutonium. And this particular surface water location is on the south interceptor ditch, which runs very closely to Woman Creek. And it runs into Pond C2, which is one of the terminal ponds that they want to breach the dams.
Is this the April 2021
Yes, it is.
plutonium?
Yes, it is. I should note downstream from SW027 and the C2 pond is the Wampauck location, which is the point of compliance. There has never been an exceedance of the surface water standard at this point of compliance, so there isn't plutonium leaving the site that is above the standard. However, SW027 is a point of evaluation, which is supposed to be an early warning for any sort of issues that may be coming downstream to that point of compliance. So it's a really important issue to follow closely. And like you said, Mayor, the most recent reportable condition was April 30th, 2021. And when there is a reportable condition, which essentially means that they have a rolling average, a 12-month rolling average, and that they have exceeded the standard for that 12-month rolling average. And this triggers a process where DOE needs to write a report, which is called a contact record. This contact record has not been released yet. And this is because DOE and CDPHE are actually kind of disagreeing on on where they should be adding more erosion controls, essentially, because that's essentially how they're going to try and solve this issue, is more erosion controls. And DOE wants to do erosion controls on a small site, and CDPHE wants them to evaluate in a larger scale, similar to what I'm showing here, but they haven't released that exact map yet. This is one from a previous contact record. So I'm following this really closely, and I'd be happy to update council as we find out more information, but it is currently in dispute resolution, and we're not sure when we'll hear more about that. I do know that they have just submitted the official report, which is a collaboration between DOE, EPA, and CDPHE. They have to put a report together stating that they're in dispute, and it moves up the chain, and the higher ups in those organizations end up making those decisions. So that's what I've been working on with that. And I hope that that gave you enough information to go into talking about the Greenway trails. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Reilly to talk about that.
Can you hear me okay? No. Let's scoot over. How are we doing now? I can move the box. Novel approach. Thank you. Thank you, Council. I appreciate your time to talk about this. So the Rocky Mountain Greenway Trail actually is a big initiative. It's part of a federal's program, the America's Beautiful Act, and the Colorado. It was part of an initiative in 2016. It's 16 and 16. The state identified 16 large-scale regional trails that would be developed over the next several years. This trail is envisioned to go ultimately from basically the airport to Rocky Mountain National Park. You get off a plane, get on your bike, and get up to the Rocky Mountain National Park. Currently, it runs from the arsenal and dead ends on what used to be the Woman Creek Reservoir property, which is now city-owned open space. In 2016, the Jefferson County came to the city of Westminster, Boulder County, City of Boulder, Broomfield, Arvada, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with a proposal to submit an application for a federal lands access program grant, FLAP grant. That grant would provide for a crossing at Indiana, which would be an overpass, as well as a underpass at 120. Total project cost there is somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 million, of which the partners would be paying 17%. City of Boulder's, or City of Westminster's portion is about $220,000. City of Boulder and Boulder County is a little bit higher because of the nature of their excuse me. So currently, as I said, this trail ends in the Woman Creek property. That property was owned previously by Woman Creek Reservoir Authority. And Jefferson County, actually, to make this trail go forward, came to the table, negotiated an acquisition for the city, and actually fronted half that money. So we split the purchase of the Woman Creek Reservoir Authority property with Jefferson County to make this trail possible. I'm getting ahead of myself in my slides too. So as part of council's agreement back in 2016 to take part in the FLAP grant and all of the various boards, there was some strict language on developing a sampling analysis plan. See that noted as a SAP. And it took several years for them to develop the plan standards. We reviewed all the previous plans that were just outlined to you, and then ultimately collected an additional 650 data points at the 2 crossings. And the result of that sampling analysis plan, every single one of those samples was lower than the historic and well below, excuse me, the safe levels. With those findings, it came back to all of the various boards to move forward with that application. As of today, the planning and design for both the underpass and overpass are underway. The bridge is in 30% design. Just received those 30% design within the last few weeks, and anticipate construction to be started sometime late next year and completed hopefully by the beginning of 2020. With that, I'm glad to answer any questions about the trail, and I appreciate your time.
Councilor Baker? Oh, Councilor Numella.
Do you have a map of the trail alignment in relation to the contours?
I don't know that I have it. We can. So no, I don't have any relation. What you can see, the crossing is at Indiana. It is right near the Woman Creek line. So if you look at where Woman Creek comes across, it's just north of that.
Does it get, I'm assuming the contours, they obviously go down to 0 with that dotted line, so it's more intense on the inside of this is the PO?
So you're looking at,
I'm looking at the trail alignment being in the, kind of right in the middle of it.
all of those, yes, the closer you get to the central operating, yes, the level of contamination does go.
Yes, that is correct. And also it kind of, the contours kind of move in a southeastern pattern. So as you move from the central operable unit southeast, it gets less and less, but primarily the contours move in that southeastern pattern. If that helps.
Okay. It would help to have a map that overlays them.
And we could work on that in the future, yeah. We'll definitely get back to you with that.
Councilor Baker?
Yeah, this map is amazingly helpful. I know when I was on council before, the Greenway Trail had several, well, it was interesting. On the internet site, it didn't even show where the trail would go. But I had seen some alignment where it trailed across the northeast corner.
That's correct. One of the initial layouts for the trail was to traverse basically parallel to Indiana to connect to 128. It was multiple creek crossings, more habitat impacts that way. They did reroute it. Part of that was Broomfield's request to get it away from their creek, ranking on the name of Walnut Creek, and come around the other way.
In many ways, this is a much better alignment because when the alignment was across the northeast corner, it went through the highest contamination part. And I assume on your maps, these are really isobars. And did they go up really exponentially? That was the advantage of the Cray-Hardy map. It had a key to it, so we could interpret this. This has no key. This has circle dots and blue dots and red dots and have no idea what they mean.
Right, and that was just for the purpose of the presentation. I can get you the original of that map.
Okay, well, it still appears to me that the crossing from us at Indiana is at site B. Okay, isn't that in a highly contaminated part of the buffer zone?
What I would say is, again, the sampling was done exactly at that site. 650 samples that I just mentioned were done at exactly the two crossing points. All of those samples are below, significantly below, what is thought to be the risk level for plutonium. So I'm not comfortable saying it's a highly contaminated area. What I'm saying is there was sampling directly at our crossing point, and that those samples indicated that there was low risk, less risk than background radiation at those sites.
Why wouldn't the trail go in at the very south edge of the buffer zone?
So what I can say is
So
multiple.
take B and move it all the way down to the bottom of the page.
So crossing Indiana, the crossing it's an elevated crossing, has to be a minimum of 14 feet above the center road grade. So initially this crossing was going to be a little bit further north in Broomfield. If you've driven that stretch of Indiana, that's where the old railroad used to come across. That's the lead. As you move down Indiana, there is no grade differential from one side of the road to the other. You cannot make a crossing. That's part of it. There were multiple analyses as to where the crossing should be made. I can provide you with that. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has done an extensive review on that. But this was identified as the ideal location for both a safety and construction standpoint.
So we couldn't pile up dirt and make a crossing like we do at 100 other sites in the city?
I'm really struggling with visualizing where you're talking about, but I'm also thinking you're down now off of publicly owned and onto what would be Woman Creek property.
Okay, using this map. Okay. The site B is roughly in the middle of the red line that's Indiana, correct?
Can you show me? I apologize, I can't see which map.
Site B roughly there, correct? Here's the map. It's roughly in the middle of the central operating unit. The central operating unit would be right there. So it's roughly in the middle.
I will say that's probable. Without laying those two maps on each other, I'm not comfortable.
This is all Westminster's property, right?
This here is all owned by Woman Creek.
So it's owned by Jeff. Well, we own half of it, right?
No, we don't own it.
Did we pay for half of it?
North of it, up here. So including the Mountain Reservoir, all of that's going to be more or less. Anything south of that reservoir.
It's owned by Jefferson County.
No, it's owned by
Okay, so the trail hasn't asked to go through Woman Creek Reservoir property.
No, Woman Creek Reservoir 30 feet not want the trail, which is why Jefferson County facilitated the purchase portion of it to make the trail.
Okay. Thank you.
I can recreate it now to answer your question better.
And just to clarify a little bit, I think what you're getting at with the contours is just worrying about the contamination in
Right.
the specific
See,
area.
because-
Yeah.
See, because, well, the contour contaminations, when you end up in the middle of the property, you're at some of the highest contamination levels.
Right.
And then as you traipse, and then this trail takes us traipsing south,
Well, the
south, and so you're going lower down in the contours, of course, but you're still going through some pretty high contours, right?
Right. And I'm not saying that they're not potentially the most contaminated portions of the refuge, but what you have to understand is the actual risk assessment performed on the refuge. The maximum contamination that they found on the refuge was 20 picocuries per gram, and CDPHE did a risk assessment on if all of the refuge was at this 20 picocuries per gram, what would the risk be for a person who is recreating out there. And it's still, even if it was at that 20 picocuries per gram, you would still have a 2 in 1 million chance of developing cancer from this, per their risk assessment. So while it might be the most contaminated in reference to the rest of the refuge, it's still a low amount of contamination.
Okay. And if we allowed the trail to run up the very eastern side of our open space there, so we could run up Sims and then it would have to jog a little west, then run up to Broomfield's property in the Great Western Reservoir, aren't we talking orders of magnitude less contamination?
Possibly, but I would have to look into it a little bit more to
Right.
give you a.
See, because one of my concerns is, one of the issues with this property is all the deception that's gone on in history. There's been enormous deception. If you go back to the 1970s, there was the public health official of Jefferson County, Dr. Johnson, if I'm not mistaken. And he was blowing the whistle on this property, and he was vilified and demeaned and demonized. And it turned out in the end, he was right. And the whole point of the buffer zone is the buffer zone was bought to guarantee that people wouldn't enter onto the property. And there's been no cleanup in the buffer zone, correct?
That is correct, but that was because it was evaluated due to the sampling that was performed out there. It was evaluated, and because of the risk exposure, like I said, being 2 in 1 million chance, per Colorado's regulations on your risk that you can have due to a Superfund cleanup, your risk should be between 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 1 million. So
Right.
it falls within the range of acceptable.
I understand all that, but it goes back to the trust factor. When you have a situation where the public has been intentionally and purposely lied to in the past, I think it's really understandable that they're not as willing to trust what's going on in the future. And if there is a less contaminated alternative, that's the one that I would choose.
And I definitely, I see what you're saying. This is Rocky Flats in and of itself is an emotional issue, and there's a lot of controversy attached to it. But all we can tell you is that what the data tell us, and what the Colorado regulations and the federal regulations deem as acceptable for risk.
Okay. And the problem with plutonium is that it's an alpha emitting particle. The risk is similar to radon in our basements. Okay, except that this is not a gas, it's a particle. And it's in the dust that people walk in.
Councilman, I will tell you, there's no argument that crimes were committed at Rocky Flats. That's a fact. What I can say is the data that we have today, again, we did an extensive review as part of the SAP analysis of all the existing data, as well as the additional 650 new points, all of which show that the risk is below background. And you're correct. The risk from plutonium, it's an inhalation risk. But it's a matter of volume of exposure. And the quote is, millions of dust particles contaminated with plutonium dioxide must be inhaled in order for significant radiation doses to occur. There's never a zero risk. We're not saying there is zero risk of increased cancer by using this site. What we're saying is the risk is minuscule. It's less than 0.0017%. This is one of the most extensively sampled and tested areas. As far as relocating the trail, the trail on the Rocky Flat side, they've already built a large portion of it. They're going to continue to build their trails on that side of the fence. It's a question of whether or not we as a city are going to connect to it. Where we connect to it, that point has been identified as the best connection. The risk across the site, yes, there is a difference in different areas, but it's not, nowhere is that risk above acceptable CDPHE limits or even federal government limits. And the locations that we're talking about have been sampled extensively.
Thanks.
Counselor Emmons?
As a point of assistance to Counselor Baker and Counselor Nurmela, in our packet, it has the study that shows direct elements that list in relation to the Greenway Trail. So that might be helpful in review, but it's listed in there.
Counselor Seymour?
Thank you, Councilor Emmons. I didn't see that. If we were able to keep it, let's what's and ifs here. If we were able to keep it on the eastern side of Indiana and then get another crossing point, that would still lead us to have to cross Walnut Creek. Wouldn't that be correct?
Woman Creek, yes. That would be.
Well, in Walnut Creek, because I was saying on the northern end, because that was part of what Broomfield didn't want to have cross. So it still flows on the eastern side of Indiana. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on the north, very north.
Okay.
If the trail was rerouted to go north from the direction.
Okay. And then, and I see too, it's south of that B, I know other than the Woman Creek, then that's private property just south of that. So the golf course, center property, all those to the west of that is all private, correct?
On our side, on the
east side of Indiana.
Yeah, there are several private parcels in it as well.
Okay. All right. I'll have more later. Thank you.
Counselor Izadi?
Thank you, Mayor. This study that you're referring to, that's this 2014 study. That was in that packet.
No, there should be a I believe the date on this is 2021. It's the sampling analysis plan.
The one in the packet says 2014 findings.
No, there's a link in your packet.
Oh, I see it.
to
Okay.
It's several hundred pages.
My question here is, so you say that the risk acceptance regulatorily speaking, right, is acceptable risk of doing this. But as we just saw with the pandemic, right, science doesn't change, but risk acceptance changes over time. And when I think about my 7-year-old daughter and taking her on this trail with the background of, well, it's an acceptable risk is what they told me. So let's go on, let's take this, a future hiking trail, right? Trip. I don't think there is an acceptable low amount number you can tell me that's greater than 0% that would enable me to morally, with my heart, support this. Because yes, there's been a lot of illegal activity, and we've talked about that, but not even talking about that, just morally knowing that there's greater than 0% risk and that risk acceptance criteria changes over time by these federal regulatory bodies, that would be an unacceptable risk for me. I just wanted to say that.
That's perfectly respectable. I understand that. I would like to point out what we're talking about, though, is a physical crossing. The activity is already going on. We are already hiking and biking and walking our dogs on this land on the Woman Creek Reservoir. On the Rocky Flat side, they are already hiking and biking. What we're talking about actually is just connecting those two pieces. It's not a question of whether or not we're going to have trails or not. We've already walked down that path.
Do we know why Broomfield got out of this?
I personally wouldn't speak to Broomfield's. It's not my knowledge base. I do know that it was intertwined with their discussions on Jefferson County Parkway. So that was both those issues got joined together.
Counselor Emmons? Anyone else? My concern, and I know people are using it, But I also know I sat 2 times in DOE's office in DC asking to see the other dump site that no one will ever talk about. And the workers out there will tell you where it was. And I have no idea what has or hasn't happened to that site. So I think it's at time, and I sat on the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council, fought for when they were trying to shut down all of the testing for the very reasons of what they had in April show up because it's water. And I said, I don't care how costly it is our water for 3 cities. And so we don't take that lightly. And so will I ever go on it? No, I don't have any desire to. To me, it's not clean. They've made it feel good and terrific, but 18 inches isn't very much to cover up. So do you need any decisions tonight? You just were having a discussion, right?
No, council asked for information.
Okay. Anything else, Councilor
Yeah.
Baker?
I would like to ask this council to reconsider our authorizing of like the connection oversight fee. I think that if we give our approval of this, I think it telegraphs to the public that it's okay. And I don't really feel that it's okay. I'm not against the Greenway Trail. It's much better now that it's not going across the northeast corner of the property. Going on the west side of Rocky Flats was good because the wind blows east and the contamination was blown east and it wasn't blown west. But this site B is right in the middle of the isobars that are pretty multiple times. And if we can lower the risk by 20 or 100, I'd much rather do that. And so if we can't run it on the east side of our property because Broomfield doesn't want to cooperate, I would be okay with running it on the very south edge of our property to put it farther south from where it is on B.
Sounds like it's already under construction.
Well, it's under design, I think you
It's
said
30% design drawings.
And it had been approved, correct? Back in 16?
It was approved last February.
Last February. Councilor or Mayor Pro Tem?
All of life has risks, and we all get to decide which risks that we each want to take. So I respect and understand, and I've lived next to the Rocky Flats my entire life. So I totally understand the issue and the situation. Most of my neighbors' parents worked at the flats because that's how Countryside was. Most working adults, they lived out there because they were all working at the flats. My concern with not giving a crossing that we've already approved is people are still going to figure out a way to use that trail. And I feel like the risk that you're going to have to both motorists and hikers and cyclists, if they're going to try to cross Indiana, that's a real risk that we have to deal with too, because I don't think you're going to stop the avid. I drive around out there one afternoon, you see plenty of people biking in ways that I think are probably unsafe because they want to be out there. So I'd be open to whether or not we have some sort of signage that lets people know, the risk that's involved with it. I think that would be fair. But the reality is it's going to happen anyway. I also don't know, in a perfect world, Councilor Baker, if our partners said, yeah, we'll go ahead and move it, that would be one thing, but it doesn't sound like anybody would approve another crossing area. I know that we extensively talked about this before, so I'm more along the lines of whether or not I go out there, I don't know. I would like the public educated about it because I think that that's fair. I would also say that a lot of these studies and samplings have been so rigorous because of the malfeasance and illegal activity or dishonesty in the past, and that's why we've seen so many studies. So I don't have a problem with the recent studies because I think they were under such rigorous watch that I'm sure that they're on the up and up. But I would have a problem with us at this point not putting that in there because it's already been approved and I think it causes other safety hazards.
Councilor Seymour?
Yeah, just one, thank you, Madam Mayor. One follow-up question on the samples for A and B sites on the crossing. Were there any samples on the eastern side of Indiana taken?
Yeah, both the physical location where the bridge was going in, and if you look into the sample analysis plan results that will show you exactly where they were taken, but there were equally representative samples on both sides of the bed.
Thank you.
I see nothing else. Thank you for a great presentation and letting us know where we're at.
Thank you.
It's now water time.
Mayor, thank you. If I could call on Sarah Borgers, our Interim Director of Public Works and Utilities. She will introduce the team and begin the presentation on historic water demands and conservation overview.
Yes, thank you so much, Jody. Mayor Pro Tem, and City Council. I am super happy tonight. I'm going to do a post introduction. So I'm not sure that I got to introduce Tria Nance, who was there presenting on the Rocky Flats. Tria Nance is one of our chemists out at Semper, and she's clearly very knowledgeable on the Rocky Flats issue. So she's a good person to have on staff. So I just want to give shout out to her and to Joe Reale, our open space superintendent. So with that, we're going to go into two presentations that are going to go back to back, but they're sort of geared to go together. At the end of both of these presentations, we are going to have a dashboard available for City Council to use to play with some toggles and kind of see what that does for the city's water demand and city's water supply. So most of the presentation that you're going to be seeing tonight is to provide background so City Council kind of knows what all the different toggles and things do. We're going to start it off with a conversation about conservation trends. This is purely just looking at some data. There will be a few options on the dashboard for council to choose what kind of conservation trends they feel like is most appropriate to consider as we move forward. So Drew Beckwith, who is our conservation guru, and among many other job duties, he's a busy guy. He's going to go through that, and then we'll get into some other water supply stuff in the next presentation. Since Taylor's on the screen here, I'll go ahead and introduce him as well. Taylor Adams works for Hydros. He does the water supply modeling, heavy lifting for the city. And then also Megan Orloff, who is the staff representative who manages a lot of the water model stuff for us. She couldn't be here tonight, which also thank you very much for letting us attend virtually tonight. We had COVID unfortunately run through our group, so we figured you didn't want us to share in that way. So thanks for letting us attend virtually, and I will, with that, turn it over to Drew.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks. Drew Beckwith, as Sarah said, I work in the Public Works and Utilities Annex over out there in the MSC. Sarah, don't go too far. I think you get to do my first slide. So while I introduce myself, Sarah said I wear a couple different hats. My biggest one is running our conservation and efficiency programs. Those are our long-standing programs like the Slow the Flow irrigation audit that maybe one of you have participated in. And my other big hat that I wear is charging all of the tap fees for new development. So this whole presentation that you're going to get from me and Taylor and Sarah is all like near and dear to my heart. So let's go to the first slide, and Sarah, you get to present.
I tried to bow out too quickly, I think.
You tried to quick.
So there's two sides of the water supply coin. There's how much water do we have, and there are toggles associated that we'll take a look at that you can toggle with water supply. The other side is how much water do we need. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about water demand, and probably one of the biggest toggles that we have is water conservation. So that's a really important one for us to consider as we move into the dashboard. The other two we'll talk, you're going to see this slide again, so I'll go through it quickly. The first one that governs how much water the city uses is weather. That's pretty clear. If it's a wet spring, wet summer, we don't sell a lot of water. We don't use a lot of water. That impacts our water availability for that year and impacts water availability for the following year. Or if it's a very dry year, We're going to use a whole bunch of water, and at the same time, we probably don't have as much supply. So you get a kind of a double win situation with weather. And then we're going to get into land use in the next presentation. And we're really focusing just on that conservation metric tonight. So if we can go to the next slide, now I'll pass it over to Drew.
And now now back to me. The purpose of my presentation here for tonight is to give you all background on our historic water demand to hopefully help inform your choices in the dashboard. So I'm going to try to do that in 10 minutes. I'm going to show you 5 charts, and all of the charts are very similar. So the source data for everything that I'm going to show you is our billing records of metered water use. So this is our data. We have billed data by month for every single account over the past 25 years. So whenever any of you ask a question about, well, how much did this group of customers use in tier 2, or how much did so on use in the summer, I get to consult the database here of all of our water use. It is a fantastic, amazing asset that we get to ask all sorts of questions all the time. So that is the source data. It's our billed water use data. All of the charts follow a similar format. It's going to be the years along the bottom, to the left, older, to the right, more recent. And on the y-axis is going to be some measure of water use. Higher up on the y-axis is more water use, down the y-axis is lower water use. And in many of these charts, there will also be a dotted line here. And what this is sort of a line of best fit. So if you were to take your squint your eyeball and put your pen, up there, how do you draw a line that looks like it goes through those dots? And I'll point out one thing that I show the equation for that dotted line, and I'll just bring your attention to the last line there, the R squared value. Take a trip back to mathematics in high school. The R squared value represents how good of a job does the line do in matching the data. So if you have an R squared at 1, boy, that's like perfect. If you have an R squared of 0, the line doesn't do a very good job. So you'll see as I go through some of these slides, the R squared changes for various reasons. So with all of that said, this is the first slide. This is the overall summary of where we have been over the past 2 decades. What you will see is that
There's a question.
Right.
I'm looking at your slide here, and you've got people per 10,000 on the side, and your lines are all above 135 to 150,000 people. Even 2020 are above 130,000 people. Aren't we like 116,000 people?
That's a nice flag, Mayor Pro Tem. So the orange line is our service area population, not our city population, because the water utility provides water to Shaw Heights and also unincorporated Jefferson County. And also in this graph is also the water use that we provide via contract to Federal Heights.
Is there in the memo an actual breakdown of residents versus Shaw Heights versus unincorporated versus whatever other buckets that make up that number?
No, that's not in the memo, but I can provide that for you. You bet.
That would be great. Thank you.
Sure. The short answer is that it's probably on the order of 90% of our water use is associated with our City of Westminster residents.
We have one more question.
I was just building off of it. Would it help with those other, like the Shaw Heights, Jefferson County, et cetera, to indicate the agreement that we have with them and the timing of that, the length of that agreement, or would that help with your?
Any information we could get would be helpful, but I mean, if you're talking about declining water demand, we need to understand declining water demand versus a City of Westminster resident versus these other entities. We're taking measures within the city to educate our populace on ways to save water. So we should know the difference in trends. Like I should be able to see them on a different line, quite frankly, because I want to know how well is Westminster and its residents doing at saving water versus its partners who we are providing water to, so that we can understand if we have any areas of opportunity to increase our conservancy, where those areas of opportunity live.
There's one more question, Councilor Baker.
Thank you. Yeah, in the service areas, we would want to know the population, the number of users. Because I don't think Shaw Heights or Federal Heights or unincorporated Jefferson County have grown that much in population. And your line through the blue, through the really demand is very nice. But in your reference material, it said most of that was indoor water savings on indoor water appliances. So are we at the limit of that? There's only so much. I mean, you can't run that line out to 100 years and have zero water demand. We all know that.
Great foreshadowing, Councilor Baker. I think you looked at my last slide. So let me tell you this chart. I think you guys all got the point here. We have total water use per year is going down over time, in spite of the fact that our service area population is going up. We are using less total water today than we were a decade ago, in spite of the fact that we have added 15,000 residents to our community and 150 new commercial business accounts. That is because of all sorts of things. It's the conservation programs that we run and offer for our community. It's because of the price of water. It's because of state legislation. It's because of social norms that are changing in Colorado. So all of those things together, I think the story that I want to convey at this slide is that so much of our water use today, so much of our land area is built out that what our current customers do, even if it's little tiny small actions individually, we have so many current customers that it really adds up to a large impact. Let's go to the next slide. Councilor Baker, this is getting at some of your questions. So now I'm bifurcating not total water use, we're looking at just the indoor water use here in particular. So again, the timeline on the, we calculate indoor water use by assuming the water use in December, January, and February is all indoor water use, because in Colorado, we tend not to irrigate outside in the middle of winter. So it's a very nice proxy. This indoor water use is declining pretty substantially. You notice the R squared on this one of 0.82. That orange dotted line is doing a very good job of representing the data. So this in particular is because of some federal and state laws that have been in place. Most recently in 2016, the state of Colorado passed a law for water sense only fixtures. And what happens here is that you may have a 3-gallon per flush toilet or a 5-gallon per flush toilet if your home is super old. You physically cannot go buy that toilet anymore. The most water that a toilet can use for sale in Colorado is 1.28 gallons per flush. You cannot buy a high water use shower head anymore. You can't buy a high water use faucet. So this was a state law that came into effect. And so every time someone replaces a toilet, remodels a bathroom, builds a new home, et cetera, those are all high water use efficiency fixtures. The gradual replacement of those fixtures over time is really what is driving this decline in indoor water use. As Councilor Baker alluded to, this is really, I believe, the underlying trend for why our total water use is also declining. Let's go to the next slide. Outdoor water use.
Hang on one second. We have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So,
Should we go back to indoor?
Yeah, just real quick. You mentioned, so this is basically built off the same time period where we're deciding what people pay for their sewer rates, correct? That same time period? Is that where you're gathering the indoor use from?
That's correct, right. So that indoor water use in the winter, we also use as a proxy for the amount of water that goes down the sewer. That's what we base the monthly sewer bill on, is that December, January, February water use.
Can we go back to that third slide real quick? I'm looking at the outdoor use slide. I'm just curious to kind of make sure I understand. So you have this that goes back to 2000. Is that when we started that practice of, like, have we always done the sewer rate based that same way?
I don't know the answer to that question. Does anyone else online know when we started charging our sewer based upon the average winter consumption?
Let me tell you the reason my question, just because maybe it gives better so I don't have to continue down the path of my thinking. So I know for a fact that people, at least over the last, say, 4, 6, 8 years, realize that's when you're going to start deciding their sewer rate. So I don't know about you folks, but I know plenty of people that in those months where they know that that's when they're going to base the rate, people purposely conserve in those months. And the reason I think that's important to think about is at some point, how much is that skewing what we're looking at as far as conservancy? Or do we think that that's minute enough that it's not? It tells you in your bill that that's when they're going to judge. So
I would beg to differ. I think Councilor Azadi points this out too, is even if it is on the bill, it's human nature does not necessarily change. Our daily habits are fixed for the most part.
I know people doing it, so thought
Well,
I'd ask the question.
I've run into people the same thing too that have told me they shower at the gym and, you know, they shower at work and then they cut down, but human nature does not change us that much.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's go to the next slide on outdoor water use. So unlike the indoor side, the outdoor trend is pretty unclear. You see the R² value of this green dotted line is a 0. So who knows? Maybe that sort of is declining off to the right. This is again total outdoor water use. A lot of our conservation programs today are focused on this outdoor water use and trying to bend the curve because really the indoor side is taken care of, quote unquote, by that state legislation. So this is where most of our conservation programs are targeted. I would hope over the next couple of years that we would start to see a decline in our outdoor water use as a result of some of the recent investments we've made on increasing our outdoor water conservation programs. We seem to have questions on each slide, so I'm happy to pause here if there's any.
Yeah, Councilor Azadi.
Thank you, Mayor. So the R² here is 0. And I'm curious why it would be 0. So I know it means it doesn't do a good job at showing the trend of the dots, but does that mean that that it's unreliable to assume that this looks like it's sort of going down?
The 0 means that equation immediately above it does not do a very good job of projecting water use. That's what the 0 means.
So is the conclusion of this that we don't know if water use outdoors is going up or down?
I can't say with mathematical certainty that water use is going down. I think if you kind of look at it, maybe there's an overall trend to the right. I think it kind of depends on where you start and end your line. You know, if you look all the way back to 2000, it's maybe a little bit down. That's why I was right. The title here is the trend is unclear.
So I think that it would be interesting to know the spikes more than long-term trend here. For example, that 2010 to 2011 spike. And just the major movements, right? To know what the drivers are of the major spikes up or down might be more interesting on this slide.
Yeah, Councilor Azadi, the major drivers here for trends in total outdoor water use will be the weather. So 2011, 2012, pretty hot, dry summers, a lot of water use.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Do we have follow-up with people who take advantage of some of our programs like the sprinkler review and whether or not people take action? I had a neighbor of mine tell me that they took advantage of it. They came out and they thought that the findings made sense, but it wasn't something they could actually implement. And so it got me wondering like how often people are able to get take the recommendation. So I'll give you the specifics of the one that was shared with me. Is they said because of her yard is on a slope that it would be better if the sprinkler heads were tilted. And so, I mean, that would basically be redoing the whole system from what she said. So I'm just curious. It got me wondering, like, do we do follow-up to know, like, are those recommendations being used when people go out and have those reviews?
I can answer that in two ways. The vendor that runs all of our outdoor programs is a nonprofit called Resource Central. They've been our partner in many of these programs for the past couple decades. They frequently ask our customers, participants in their program, what did you think? Did it work well? Was this a good investment of your city's resources, et cetera? So those they provide in an annual report. I have several of those. I can include those along with the previous questions you guys have asked. So you can see overwhelmingly people that participate in these programs think they're great. It helps them save water. They understand what they're supposed to do. And so that's to the review side of things. But I also heard you ask, can we see real water savings in our customers that participate in these programs? So given our great data set, I did actually this query last year, and I looked at participants who had done a slow the flow irrigation audit, who had, I have their information that they did the audit. And lo and behold, they did save a significant, their water use in the years following their appointment was significantly lower than the control group. So
That's good. I mean, are we advertising that as we advertise those programs? Because I think that makes that much more powerful if we say, hey, look at the success we've done, and whatever percentage of people, you're going to make more people want to participate. I think that's great that you have that data.
We have turned that into a dollar savings and include that in some of our social media.
It would be interesting in the future if we would ask participants if they would be willing to tell their story, because I know we have times in the past where we have residents share their story, and I think this is an area where if you had participants who would be willing to do that when they go out, it would be powerful to hear that from your neighbors so that people want to participate.
Councilor Baker?
Yeah, looking at this chart and then factoring in the population growth that's gone on, of course, per capita water use has gone down. And then making the very simple observation of all the dead lawns and dead trees, yeah, water use has gone down. What is not on this chart is the cost of these savings that our city has paid.
I don't see any other questions.
Councilor Baker got me again. Let's go to the next slide. Per capita water use. So this is the same information that is in the first slide that had total water use and population, but here I just divide them for simplicity. So this is a system-wide average per person water use. In the industry, we call this per capita water use, or GPCD. And you see here let's say our average water use back in 2000 was maybe around 150 GPCD. And today we are down maybe 130-ish GPCD. So we are using less total water. I guess, so the math would show if we are using less total water and we have more people, of course, the amount of water used by an average customer has gone down.
Councilor Baker?
And the way this is really calculated is all water uses and just divided by the number of people, correct?
That is correct, Councilor Baker. This is the most simple, we call that system-wide per person water use, right? So it's all the water divided by all the people.
Right. And so if you had some enormous water user who changed their habits, it could have a dramatic impact on this number.
That's exactly true. Many people view this metric with a little bit of caution, especially when comparing between cities. So for instance, Greeley has a couple very large food manufacturing facilities that use about 1/3 of their water. The city of Westminster doesn't have those. So should we be comparing our per capita water use to Greeley? Maybe not. But as long as our uses within the city sort of maintain some bit of normalcy, it's a good internal tracker for us.
Thank you.
No more questions.
Great. Let's go to the last slide, which is this slide again, but sort of squished and provided another 20-year horizon. So this is the slide that talks about the options you'll get to choose in the dashboard. So these were developed through a scenario-based planning approach, And the end values here of per capita water use in 2040 were based upon consultant research. Actually, Taylor did this work. So if you have specific questions about how they got to, the man is on the phone. And I'll just describe them briefly. I think they are pretty self-explanatory. So again, the dark blue solid line is our trend of per capita water use to date. The orange dashed line is a reversal of that trend in declines of per capita water use. The gray dashed line, conservation stagnates, is basically a flattened. We don't save any more water on a per person basis going forward. The blue line is a bit of like baseline or business as usual. It's a continuation of the current trend. And the green line, enhanced conservation, would be a steeper decline in per person water use than what we've been experiencing. And so to reference Councillor Baker's question from the very beginning, I've provided some other first world developed nations system-wide per capita water use values on the right. What you will see is that some countries use more than the city of Westminster. Some countries on an average basis use less. All these future potentials fall within the range of real possibility. So maybe I'll close, I think, with two main points. That number one, we have the ability to influence the future water demand. That's through council direction on policy and rates, customer education, financial incentives, the price of water. All of those things influence future water demand. Those are wholly within City Council's purview and ability to influence. And so number two, the future conservation that you choose in the dashboard is a very big lever. It is, according to the memo, a 10 times greater magnitude of impact as compared to any of the land use assumptions. And again, this bases back to my first comment about how so much of the land area in Westminster is already developed, that the choices our existing customers make have a very outsized influence by comparison to whatever kind of new development comes into the city. And the last slide is just the question slide. So maybe can we go back to the per capita water use dashboard trend one? And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I don't see any.
Sarah, I think that concludes me. Do I pass it back to you?
I think if mayor and council want to move over to the next presentation, I'm happy to do that.
Hang on. Do we want a break? Oh, I have a request for a break. Sorry. We'll take 5 minutes. 5 minutes and we'll be back.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, we're back.
All right, Sarah Borgers, if you'd like to lead us off into presentation 3 on the 2021 water supply plan overview.
Absolutely. We want to bring up our first slide here. Mayor Pro Tem and Council. Like I said, this is sort of part 2 of the water supply plan conversation. And we're jumping right in. Okay. So like we talked about, there's really 2 sides of the coin. One is water supply, and you can kind of think about that as what is our bank account? How much water can our system produce? And there's really 2 toggles associated with that that we'll get into here in another couple of slides here. The other side of the coin is how much water does the city need to use, right? How much do our customers demand of the water supply that's available? And there's some toggles that you're going to be able to play with in the dashboard related to the demand side. But I kind of want to just say that out loud. Sometimes even when we're talking in our own groups, sometimes those 2 things can intermingle just a little bit. So if we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. Okay, so focusing in on the water supply. So we ran back in 2019 or so, and then an updated version later on, a water supply modeling effort that ran thousands of different model runs based on what we see in the paleohydrology. So looking back to the late 1500s, all the way back through time, we used a tree ring study to determine how often we saw dry years, how often we saw wet years, and how often we saw average years. And based on the probabilities that we saw in that tree ring study, we were able to produce 1,000 different possible futures and see what kind of water supply we could get out of those thousands of possible futures. So what you're looking at here is a graphic that shows just how much water our system can produce. And there are a couple toggles we'll talk about. The first one is risk. So we ran 1,000 model runs. We can assume that our worst year in that worst of the 1,000 model runs is where we want to plan for. That would be like a 1 in 1,000 chance that we would produce, and that's what the 23,400 acre foot number is. So that very bottom line there, that's 1 in 1,000. Our system will produce that amount of water. You'll see another line above that, the 28,150 acre feet. So one of the toggles that you'll get to choose is, do we assume that we're going to use the drought management plan that was adopted in 2019 and the restrictions that it would call for? And again, the first question is like, why the heck is it so much higher than that 23,400? When you run the model and you don't put any limits on through droughts, you end up coming into a really dry year. And then that really dry year, you use a whole lot of water, and that depletes how much water is in Stanley Lake. And so then in the next year, you don't have very much water available for that next year. And so what can happen is you use a whole bunch of water one year, and then you don't have much water in the subsequent year. So you end up with a very kind of up and down line with how much demand the system uses, or how much supply is available. When you implement drought restrictions, you sort of even that line out. So you're saving some water so that it's available for subsequent years, and that gets us through multi-year droughts. And so with the drought management in place, Taylor ran the model again, and with that drought management in place, the minimum supply, that kind of worst case scenario, is actually 28,150 acre feet. But that's a toggle within the dashboard that City Council is going to be able to use to help them decide best policy decisions moving forward. In the dashboard, you'll also have the option of choosing different risk levels. So we can choose the 1 in 1,000 option, which is the 23,400. You could also choose something that's a little less risk averse. We in water supply folks tend to be very risk averse because we never want to be the one whose community runs out of water. So we tend to be very risk averse in general. But there's options there. You can choose something that's slightly above the 1 in 1,000 chance. So those will all be available when we get into the dashboard. So we're just all kind of feeding into that. While we're on the slide, there were a couple of questions that that I think you may have gotten answers to earlier this morning, and I'll just touch base on just a few things as we go through. Moffat water. So we do get water from Denver Water. It is Moffat water from Gross Reservoir. And we have a contract with Denver Water for 4,500 acre feet. There is a take or pay amount of 1,750 acre feet. That tends to be where the number we aim for in any given year currently. But this model is showing that we're using the full 4,500 acre feet. So when we look at all of these numbers, that's assuming we're fully utilizing those Denver Water contracts. We'll also maybe on this slide real quick talk about how much water do we get from all of our water rights. That's a surprisingly, it sounds like a very simple question. It's actually really complicated. The amount of water we divert into Stanley isn't necessarily all based on the rights that we get from the ditches that flow into Stanley Lake. We are reusing, so our water is quote unquote reusable. A lot of it is. So when it comes out of our wastewater plant, we can pick that up. We can move it to different reservoirs, and oftentimes we're moving it into Stanley Lake. So we might be moving 50 cubic feet per second of water in through the Farmers Highline Canal. Some of that may be Farmers Highline water rights. Some of that may actually be water that we've recaptured and are putting back into Stanley Lake. We also have water rights that aren't associated with ditches at all. So we have water rights that tell us how much water we can move into Stanley Lake from a lower reservoir. Those are called exchange rights. So it's actually a very complicated one, but I did want to touch on it because I know that's a question that's come up a number of times. And if that's something we need to look in further, that's probably a full study we'll have to do, but I did want to touch on it. Let's see, and if we could go to the next slide. All right, so you've seen this slide before. So we talked about the water supply side. This was the slide you just saw. Oh,
somebody would like to go back one. Back one slide. Mr.
Okay.
Baker?
Yeah. I'm having a hard time understanding minimum water supply with drought management. Well, how come we have more water with drought management? How can we get more water?
Right. What the model is looking at is each of the futures, you'll hear us talking about futures. Each one of those futures is not a single year. It's a 67-year model run that has all kinds of different like dry years and wet years interspersed through it. And so it's looking at the amount of water that was available in the least year in that 67-year run. So what that means is without drought management, we're using a whole lot of water in a single year, and then yet next year that water is not available. So you end up with a very kind of up and down pattern. And so your minimum is going to be lower than if you save some in one year, and then the next year you have more water available. You end up with a more moderate kind of level instead of a very up and down where your lows are much lower.
Okay, maybe I'm dense, but if I'm understanding this correctly, the minimum water supply is we can get 4,500 acre feet out of Moffat water tops that we're guaranteed to get. And we get 19,000 acre feet out of all our Clear Creek water rights. And then the clever things we do with the reservoirs and moving water around. And that we can rely on every year. That much yield from those two sources?
We can rely on the 23,400 every year.
Okay. So then what do we do with drought management that makes 4,000 more acre feet available of water?
Because we're saving water from one year to the next. So you're taking years where things are dry, and instead of having a really high demand drain that storage, you're saving some of that water for the next year. So then the next year, you've got more water available than you would have if you didn't save that water.
Yeah. Boy, this is when it would be nice if you were in person with some charts. And so then what is the median water yield we get from our water rights? Is there such a calculation?
When we get into the
median being the middle point, with half the years we get more acre feet of water from our water rights, and half the years we get less acre feet of water from our water rights.
Yeah. So when we get into the dashboard, we can set the risk level to halfway, and we can see what that number looks like as a median number. It's not exactly right, but I mean, it'll kind of get you in the gist of what you're saying.
Okay, maybe I should just wait some. Thank you.
We'll note that question, and we can make sure and we toggle that when we get into the dashboard, so you can see kind of what that halfway point is.
Counselor Emmons?
So jumping off of Counselor Baker's question, I didn't realize this was a year over savings. So when we get to 28,150 acre feet, is that how many years, like what are we looking at for a year over year on how we would get to that number? Like, is that a what? Do you follow what I'm trying to ask here? Like, and I apologize, I'm dealing with the. Oh, it might not be.
I feel your pain. I feel your pain. So I guess maybe, and I'll answer it and see if I'm close to answering your question. If you assume that we use the drought management plan that's in place right now, the minimum amount of water that we would have available to us in any given year would be 28,150. So other years will have more water than that. This would be the minimum year.
Okay, so I'm just kind of quickly calculating at the max level at 34 divided by 67 years is 514 acre feet. So are we calculating in the 67-year increment?
Oh, I see what your question is. So this is how much water would be available in any given year.
Okay.
So every year we would have 28,000 or more.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
No more questions.
Awesome. I will say too that we're making some simplifications in this conversation that I know are probably making Taylor's head hurt just a little bit, but we're hoping to share the gist of it. And please do keep asking questions because this is complicated stuff. We want to make sure we're answering stuff. So thanks for the questions. If we can move to slide 3. All right. So we saw this in Drew's presentation. That was the supply side. So how much water do we have? Now we're getting into the water demand side. So how much does our community use? We talked about weather being one of the big things that will impact really outdoor water consumption. So weather is a huge toggle for us, but unfortunately we don't have we can't make many policy decisions about the weather. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about that. Drew talked about conservation and some of the conservation trends that you'll have the option of playing with when we get into the dashboard. And then the big one, I think that maybe is worth some good conversation is the conversation around excuse me, land use. So if we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so this will look familiar to you, just rehashing. There are 4 options in the dashboard you're going to get to choose from. One is enhanced conservation, baseline, business as usual, conservation kind of plateaus, and an increase in water use per capita. So we talked about that. We won't linger here. We can go on to slide 5, please. All right. So for land use, this work was largely done in 2019 and 2020. We evaluated almost all of our 33,000 water accounts. We did exclude accounts that were either brand new, so we didn't know if their landscaping was complete. Maybe they didn't have a complete year of water use. So there were some we didn't include because there were just technical issues with them. But by and large, we looked at all of our 33,000 water accounts. This was different than in previous studies that have been done. In previous studies, we just didn't have the computing power and all kinds of other things that allowed us to look at all of our accounts and all of the land use, their associated land uses. And so they had to take samples. So they would take a small sample size of different land use types and develop how much water each of those land use types needed. But through this and Taylor's extensive work through this, we coordinated all of our meter data with the land use type. We looked at indoor versus outdoor water use patterns and even age of construction. So this was a huge effort that resulted in a sort of simple graph. If we could go to slide 6, please. So I think you have all seen now this bar chart. That analysis allowed us to look at all different kinds of land uses and determine how many acre feet of water per acre of development the city needed to have available for different development types. I will say the bar graph with the combined land, we recently, let me back up. So the old comp plan has more categories of land use types than the new comp plan. And that does result in a slightly increased projection in how much water demand the city needs. And that's because you're taking, particularly residential, you're taking more lower dense developments and potentially allowing them to go to a slightly higher development. The change wasn't large, but it was there. So I do want to say that. The other thing that we asked for help on was our more dense residential. The city doesn't have some of the high density residential, at least not a large sampling size that we could look at to get a good feel that we understood how much water those needed. And so we actually worked with Denver Water. They needed some of our data. They were interested in looking at low density residential, which we had plenty of data on, and we needed some of their data on high density residential. So they shared with us what high density residential uses will typically use. So some of this data did come from Denver Water. The other thing that you'll notice is that we'll get really reticent to talk about a parcel by parcel analysis. And the reason for that is even within a single land use type, different parcels are going to use water very differently. We know that even from year to year, those parcels are going to use water very differently. And so we tend to look not at individual parcels, but as a compilation of the entire land use across the entire city. So you'll see us talking about overall urban multifamily will use X amount of water across the entire city. And that's just because we know that even within a single land use type, commercial, for instance, could have a restaurant or it could have a shoe store. Those two uses use water very differently. And so we're mainly looking at averages across the city as a whole. Let's see, just double checking here. So we then take this bar chart and we apply it to the land use map. So if I could get you to click one forward. So we will take the land use map, in this case, the proposed comp plan, and apply this acre feet per acre to every parcel in the city. We assume that every parcel is developed, and that results in a total water need for the city as a whole. We do have an option that you'll get to play with. There will be 4 different options for the different land use maps. You'll get to choose between an option that actually is, we call it kind of the weak economy map. Maybe there's parcels that don't develop, that are more challenging to develop. So we've got a map that is kind of preset to do that. We have a hot growth future where we took the comp plan and we said, okay, what if all of the arterials developed to a super high level, parcels are redeveloping. That's not what's in the comp plan, but we wanted to really challenge the system and see what it looked like. So you'll have an option of maps to choose from. And we also, within the dashboard, if we really want to get down into nitty gritty, can decide to change 100 acres from one land use to a different land use, or kind of get more granular than that as well. So that's something that you'll be able to get into in the dashboard. All right, if we can jump to the next slide, please. All right, so this is a pretty simple slide, putting it all together. So these are all the toggles that you're going to get to play with here in the dashboard. We did put together 4 scenarios just as examples, just to get you started and to get a sense for what we're looking at. And it's all, when we talk about a scenario, it's just all of the assumptions that we assume for that scenario. So if we can jump to the next slide, let me show you what our preset examples are. All right, so on the far left, we have kind of our challenge condition. We really wanted to see what happens if we push everything really hard. And in that example, we've got development and redevelopment, mainly along arterials. And I will say a big shout out and thank you to Andrew Spurgeon, who helped us develop these maps, because we're not land use experts, but we're really happy to work with them so they can tell us what would make sense and what wouldn't. So that is a preset map that's much denser than anything that's proposed in the comp plan. That scenario also has conservation trends reversing. So in Drew's graph, that was the one that was kind of the per capita water use was increasing. So that's our challenge condition, hot growth. The 2 that I find really interesting are the weak economy and resource aware. And we'll get it, I'll show you why that is. But the weak economy, the idea here is that there's parcels that are more difficult to develop than others, and perhaps those parcels don't develop. So we have a preset map that actually just excludes some of the parcels from the water supply plan. In that scenario, it's a weak economy, so therefore we are assuming that people aren't doing remodels. We're not investing in conservation programs. So in that scenario, the conservation trend just plateaus and our water use per capita just kind of maintains from where it currently is. The third one is business as usual. So this one has the proposed comp plan map in it, and has conservation trends continuing at the same declining rate as what we've seen in the past. That's what we're calling the business as usual. And then resource aware. This one, we assume there's a strong economy. So it's not, we've got a land use map that has a lot of development that's greater than what the comp plan uses, but not as great as the hot growth scenario. So it's got more density in it than the proposed comp plan does. But in that scenario, we're heavily investing in conservation, and conservation trends decrease at a rate greater than what we're seeing today. So our goal here was really just to kind of bookend possible futures so we could get a feel for what a future might look like and how our water supply reacts.
And we have a question, Councilor Namela.
Yeah, thanks for walking through these. Just a question, kind of what Councilor Baker brought up a lot earlier when we were looking at the conservation trend line for business as usual, assuming that the conservation trend will decrease at the same rate, or I should say decrease water use at the same rate. At some point, obviously, that's going to go down to, well, that plateau itself at some point, because if we're assuming a lot of fixtures get replaced, obviously it's not going to go down to 0. So just kind of curious, does it stop? Is it?
Yeah. So that's a bit of a crystal ball, but I will say that there's been a lot of research and study, and it's sort of the conversation that's happening in the industry right now. Is how much conservation can we expect before it hits that bottom? And industry-wide, I think the sense is that we're not close to there yet. There's still a long way to go before we hit that plateau. So we can talk about the research and stuff that's done, but in the end, there is some level of, we don't know what the bottom is, but we are not there yet.
Okay. And then just so I can clarify for myself, the only scenario where we're assuming redevelopment occurs is the hot growth.
I think the hot growth and the resource aware both assume some redevelopment, but the hot growth has most of it. And you'll have the opportunity in the dashboard. If you want to see what happens, we can change some of the land uses and we can see what happens to the model.
No other questions at this time?
All right. So now the fun part, I think we get to show a graph. Next slide, please. So we're going to try and walk through this because it's kind of a lot to take in all at once. Can we see slide 9, please? All right. So you've seen this. This is how much water supply do we have. You have a couple of options of what you want to plan for. We've got the minimum water supply of 23,400 acre feet. And we've got a minimum water supply with drought management of 28,150 acre feet. And there's sort of a range there. So now if we can click forward one. So this is our actual water demand that the city has seen from 2001 to 2019. I think that's accurate through last year as well. So this is how much water the city uses in a year. So you can see we're generally staying below that 23,400 acre feet when it comes to looking at our current demand over the past few years. The next one we'll show, if we can click forward one, is hot growth. So that's ugly. That is, close to 35,000 acre feet of use at its very top end. At its bottom end, it's probably closer to the, 26, 27,000 acre feet. That would be something that the city would really struggle to support. But like I say, the hot growth, that was our challenge condition. We were very dense in that scenario, and we reversed our conservation trends. If I can move forward one more slide, please. All right, so this is weak economy. So this is the bar graph, or the bar that shows not all of the parcels in the comp plan develop because of the weak economy, and our conservation trend continues. And so you can see there's a range, like everything we do. There's a range of possible futures. And those futures all fall below the 28,150 acre feet. But there are scenarios that are above the 23,400. And there's futures that were under that 23,400. So it's kind of falling right there on that boundary of, can we support it? Probably with drought management in place. If we can move to the next slide, please. All right, so this one is business as usual. So this one assumes that we are using the full built-out comp plan, all the land develops, and our conservation trends continue to decline at the rate that they currently are. I think probably the first thing you'll notice is that it's less than the weak economy. And what is driving that is that conservation metric. Land use, you'll see, tends to impact our overall water need less than the conservation by about tenfold. So it's a pretty big toggle. If we can jump to the next bar, please. So this is resource aware. This land use map is somewhere in between the comp plan and our dense future and hot growth. So that has a high density land use map associated with it. And this one had a really aggressive conservation trend associated with it. So we were seeing a decrease in water use per capita, decreasing less than what we're currently seeing. So this is a very aggressive kind of conservation strategy. You can see that it's well below even the 23,400 acre feet. So those are 4 examples, just to get us started and kind of get our brains thinking about what we're going to see in the dashboard. The dashboard looks a little different than this, but the same concepts all still apply. So if we can jump to the next slide, please. All right. So this is where we're going to ask council to start playing with the dashboard. You're going to have several options here. So this is just a list of all the variables you'll get to play with on the dashboard. You have 2 when it comes to the water supply side. Do we assume drought management is in place? And we talk about risk and resiliency. Do we look at that 1 in 1,000 minimum, or do we look at something greater than that? On the water demand side, you'll have 2 things that you can change. The first is the conservation assumption, and the second one is the land use map. And if you want to get more granular than the preset land use maps, we can also get in and change some variables in terms of number of acres in the land use map that are a specific land use type. All right, that was a lot, I know. And before we get into the dashboard, I just want to make sure that folks are clear. If there's anything I need to try again explaining, please let me know.
I have a question from Councillor Seymour.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. More of a clarification and see if I can wrap my head around this also, because I think there's a bit of a confusion on this. It only takes 100 years to get used to this, so we'll get it figured out by then. My tree rings are substantial. All right, so we have a concern on, and I think there's a misnomer, is that Westminster owns X number of shares of water, and or in some cases, a fixed acre feet, for instance, the Denver water contract. So shares do not in every year equate to the same amount of acre feet produced. That's correct?
That's correct, yes.
So when we're looking at that, when we're looking at the 67-year time frame, those shares and the commensurate water that those shares produce, which are in flex, the lowest would have been 23,400 acre feet. Am I looking at that correctly? Because we have the same
As a
fixed amount of shares.
simplification, yes. Yes.
Okay. Because we have the same, we have a certain amount of shares, and those shares don't always produce the same amount of acre feet every year.
Right.
So that's where the variable is there. In a drought year, then if we look at our current drought management plan, if we're looking in a drought year, and instead of draining Stanley Lake right down to the bottom, we institute those drought plans. In that case, we use that current share flow, whatever it may be, to retain that for the next year so we don't bottom out all of our options. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Because we were trying to wrap our hands around, okay, our minimum is 23.4, but with the drought management plan, we actually go to 28,150. But that's because we're conserving in 1 year. And then hopefully on average, then the next year or the next 2 to 5 years are going to fill back up all of our reserves.
Right, exactly.
Okay, I think I have a handle on it. But a maximum over 67 years, maxing our shares, maxing our Moffett Tunnel actual acre feet would be 34.5. That's the most.
Yes. That maximum is a little bit of a misnomer. If we were to get in and run the model, it would probably go higher than that in the drought management plan scenario by some amount. But we stopped running the model because the model takes a weekend or so to run. So we stopped running it when we get so far above any demand that we would ever expect to see.
Right.
Sort of
because
change the model.
If we're maxing out our shares, there's no sense in having a drought management plan. At a certain point, we can only store so much for the next year then too. Even
Essentially.
Okay.
I actually do have that extended portion of the curve in the dashboard, so we can look at those, but we can talk about why. In the past, we've talked about 34.5 as being the max. There's a lot of detail in this, but yeah, I just wanted to flag that before we get to it.
Great.
Mayor Pro Tem?
And this may get into the, excuse me, next section, but I'm trying to understand the weak economy one versus business as usual. Because to me, two likely scenarios are business as usual during a weak or strong economy, and doesn't necessarily mean that the end game is different. So I'm trying to understand why those were models. Take the mall, for example. The development of it took longer because we had ups and downs in the economy.
Can we have one conversation at a time, please? I'm sorry.
You're fine. So example being 2008, economy crashes, mall goes stop. So I'm just trying to understand why that lever was picked that way. Maybe it was just an example, but I would be interested to see business as usual during strong versus weak economy. But also, I'm trying to understand, that really is just a pause, right? To me, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to develop different. So I'm trying to understand why you feel that weak economy means long term that the development wouldn't happen.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, Councilor, or Mayor Pro Tem, my apologies. So those four scenarios are based off of the Colorado Water Plan that was recently published. We were just modeling them after similar scenarios to what the statewide did.
Okay.
They're just names. Really the important thing of it is what is the water supply need of the city if some of the parcels don't develop. So that it was just a name for the example. It really doesn't have anything to do with what the economy is doing.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Councilor Baker?
Yeah, I'm going to return to this because Councilor Seymour was trying to help me and I still don't get it. And maybe it's the way we've named it. So I look at the 23,400 as the minimum amount of water we're going to get even in a drought year. Is that incorrect?
That is, with or without drought management plan, I guess is the question. So without drought management plan, maybe I could put it
Whatever
a
we
different
do as a city isn't going to change, the yield of the rivers. We could paint ourselves blue and that's going to change the yield of water we take from the rivers. We're going to get a 2-inch board of water, whatever the height of the river is, or however it's done.
Right. Maybe I could put it a different way. So instead of how much water is available in a single year, if you look at it, how much water might be available over 2 years. I apologize, my cat did something over there. So if over the course of 2 years, you got a total of 40 acre feet. These aren't real numbers, clearly. You got 40 acre feet over 2 years. If in the first year you don't implement drought restrictions and you use 30 of those acre feet, then the next year you're only going to have 10. And so what that's going to look like in the model is you had 30 and your minimum supply. I'm kind of making Taylor cringe a little bit when I'm talking about this, but just generally speaking, the next year you're going to have 10 acre feet available the next year. So that means that you've got less water the next year. But if you implement drought restrictions in the first year, and instead of using 30 acre feet, you only use 20, then the next year you have 20 acre feet available to you. And so you don't get down to that 10 acre feet, you stay at 20 acre feet over the course of the entire time.
Except that also assumes you have an unlimited size bucket to store the water in.
So that's
And
all.
we don't have an unlimited size bucket. We've got Stanley Lake with what, 22,000 acre feet of storage, and then we're making Wattenberg and a couple other reservoirs.
I think you'd have to, Councilor Baker, sorry to interrupt, but I think you'd have to go look at the drought management plan and see the way that it's implemented. Because it's done over time to be able to say we're at this certain point of storage at this point in time. And so then if at that point in time it looked like drought conditions were going to put us in the next couple months into a position where we weren't replenishing our water, it would put restrictions in place at that point in time. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the assumption is we already have that water, and that's how we do the drought management. Is that accurate? That's the way I recall it.
I've really looked at the drought management plan that's on the web, and it just has use and how we cut down use as we go along.
If I may.
Unless there's another.
Well, no, you're correct, but I think too, as far as our labeling, I think the part of the confusion would be, what if we looked at, let's say, a scenario that we had no storage?
Okay.
To use a baseline.
Right.
Okay, so if we had a baseline, what if we had no storage capability and we only could, the shares that we're taking in and then the fixed acre feet that we take in, what would that be? I mean, that would give us a baseline in that case too, because you're talking about
like the baseline for a drought year stream flow.
Okay.
So this would be a minimum, of in a drought year of what our shares would produce.
Okay.
Yield.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the label that I think that's the baseline. Yeah. Assuming that way we don't have to worry about the drought management plan. Let's say Westminster had no storage facilities. How many acre feet of water would we have coming in a year?
In a drought year.
In a drought year. We know that. I mean, over the 67 years. So
yeah.
Yeah, and maybe Taylor can correct me here. The system's really geared towards utilizing storage. So I'm not sure how we could just take the storage component out. We get all of our water during like a couple months, so I don't know how we would be able to do that.
Well, one way we can look at it is we have a historical run where we look at current demands in the face of historical hydrology. And in that run in 1954, the yield is around 16,000 acre feet. So if you had a horrible future where the year 1954 just repeated, going forward, that would be the minimum reliable supply. But fortunately, none of the modeling suggests futures that dry.
Okay, and that makes sense because I was trying to find one of the briefings we had, and it had 16,000 acre feet as a low year. And I would assume the 54, that was before the Moffett or not?
This is assuming current operations, so it does have Moffett in there, but part of and I will tend to maybe go into too much detail sometimes, but one of the things with the Moffett water is that Denver can reduce the delivery in years where they're delivering less to their customers, and so we account for that in the modeling and take a 15% hit during drought years based on what discussions with them and what we anticipate would happen. But that all is to say that in the version of 1954 that I'm talking about is a 1954 where we hypothetically have the city's current water rights portfolio. And so that's what it looks like we would have yielded then. And 2002 is pretty similar.
And for clarity, 1954 for a lot of communities is their planning drought. That was a very bad drought in the 50s, and the other one is 2002, which was much shorter for reference.
Okay, so in other words, when I ask my question, what does minimum reliable supply mean? That's when I said, is this the median as many years above as are below water yield from our water shares? In a sense, that's what this is then, right? because we're using,
No, it's not a median.
we're
It's the
using the
minimum
years
that
when we
our
only
system-
get 16 total yield. We're using stored water to bring us up to the 23,400 water we can use that year, right? So we're actually drawing out 7,400 acre feet of water from Stanley Lake in anticipation of the next year filling it back up.
I see what you're getting at, Councilor Baker, in that what we're calling the minimum reliable supply is something that we would feel comfortable saying that the system could deliver over the roughly 7-decade period that the model run covers. And so in that sense, it's a relatively closer to the middle of the distribution in that future. I think where we're getting hung up is that we have a whole distribution of futures as well. And so it's the worst of those 1,000 futures. And in that worst of the 1,000 futures, it would be, that's the amount that could reliably be delivered.
Okay, we can move on.
Councilor Namella?
I almost forgot my question. Okay, for these scenarios, are we assuming there's some build out date and is that
Yes.
really realistic?
Yes, that's a really great question, Counselor. So yes, this would assume it's an end state, and I know there's a lot of discussion about, do you ever really finish developing a city? The maps that we're showing here are what we assume to be build out, and what the ultimate water need of the city will be. A lot of that has to do with, we don't really know. We may get to some future where what the city looks like is not the comp plan. When we get that far into the future, we also don't know how we're going to be using water. So you start getting into those far out decades, and there just gets to be more questions than answers. And it's hard to have confidence in the data that you're getting. I will say one of the things that we've talked about is doing water supply plan that goes out 100 years. That's primarily to look at climate change, but that gets really complicated, is how do you make assumptions of what land use is going to look like 100 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, I remember working with staff to get to 50 years on for our big sewer planning, but I think as you continue to work on this model, I would encourage us to speak with other communities that are more at that built out state, and kind of get an idea of looking at their unit, their permit counts, or their kind of stasis development activity, because there's always going to be some, and you might be able to at least get some type of average for those years.
Sure.
Councilor Emmons?
So 3 years at the dais, and we're still having this conversation. It's still very complicated. So quick question. I'm trying to follow, maybe we're all hung up on this maximum and minimum water supply, but every month you or staff gives council a report on the status of Stanley Lake and its water and how much we have and where it's at. So when you say, or when staff says it's 85% full or 90% full, what is the baseline? What does that mean? What is the baseline that we understand then that it's 85%?
So what we're talking about there is that we've got roughly 22,000 acre feet of storage in Stanley Lake. That's just the city of Westminster. And so if we're 80% full, that means we've got 80% of that 22,000 acre feet has water in it.
So our minimum then is the 22 for a baseline.
Yeah, that's what the reservoir is full at. But keep in mind too that there's constantly water going in and out of the lake. So 22,000 isn't necessarily what we're going to produce. I will say, and maybe Taylor, if I say anything wrong here, you can correct me. How the model works is we drain the reservoir down to 3,000 acre feet, I think. And we keep that buffer there just kind of as an emergency level, plus you start draining the reservoir and the water quality gets really bad. So in the model run, we are really pulling Stanley Lake way down to meet some of these numbers. So when you talk about 80%, we're still doing way up here. We do in the model pull that reservoir level down much farther than what it currently does.
Okay, thank you.
I see no more questions.
Are you all ready for the fun part where I turn it over to Taylor and we look at the dashboard?
Let's go.
All right. Our magic behind the curtain AV people, if you could transfer over to Taylor's computer, that would be great.
Right. Thanks, Sarah. I'm gonna try to get everything set up, make sure you're looking at the right one of my screens. Okay, you should see a browser window that says Westminster Land and Water Use Planning Dashboard.
Yes.
All right. Great.
And I think we were going to start on the forecasting results, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so I'd like to start out and just get you all oriented to everything that's included in the dashboard, and then we can turn it over to you for some suggestions about how we can use it. So in general, what we have, the way that we have it set up is that we have two scenarios, scenario A and scenario B, and they're each comprised of a set of water use assumptions and land use assumptions. And we're able to compare the demands. So these two bars illustrate the range of demands from the two scenarios. The default right now, they're both the proposed comp plan. So it's the business as usual water use assumptions, and then the proposed comp plan land use assumptions. The darkest bar at the bottom on these stacked bar charts, the top of that illustrates the minimum demand from the scenario under consideration. The medium blue bar extends up to the median of the distribution, and then the light blue goes up to the top of the demand distribution. And so we're able to also just add on our water supply to compare it visually on the same chart here. So I'll add that on by enacting this toggle over here on the left. You can see that I've activated the drought management plan with the other toggle. So the purple line is illustrating the minimum reliable supply with the drought management plan. We have a slider here where we can choose an acceptable hydrologic risk percentage. So right now at 0, this means that we're in that worst future that we've been discussing, where we can get 28,150 with the drought management plan. The other 999 futures are available here. And so that's an option that we have to provide some context for the demand distributions.
So Taylor, can I stop you here?
Yep.
There were so many questions on this water supply piece. So right now we are assuming that there's drought management plan in this scenario. That's why it's at the 28 and change. If we unclick that box, we go down to the name of the number's escaping me, 23.1. So that goes down to that level if we unclick that. So that's the blue chart that we were looking at early on in the conversation. So if we could maybe Taylor, leave it here for just a second without the drought management plan. We're at the 23 and change right here. What happens if we move our risk up to halfway? Because I think that gets at perhaps Councillor Baker's question of what's that kind of median value look like. So can we take a look at what that scenario is? So in that scenario, where we've got some years that are more and some futures that are more and some futures that are less, this is kind of that halfway point, and that's 30,000 acre feet or so. So that might be the question of like, what is that median point?
Yeah, and that's, I would say it's probably the most likely system yield would be right around there, but as is standard practice, we want to be very conservative in our planning and not count on something that, even though it's likely, there are other futures that are plausible that come out of this that would be concerning. So that's why we tend to have this risk percentage at the lower end of the spectrum.
Does that help answer?
Mayor Pro Tem?
I just want to make sure that I understand your levers here. Business as usual would be 2013 comp plan, and proposed would be the current 2040 in its current state.
The business as usual is one of the water use assumptions. So on the left-hand side, we've got the 4 different water use assumptions. And then the right-hand side here, these are our land use maps.
Those are the conservation toggles on the left.
Right.
The
So
business as usual.
So there's not a land use that is the current comp plan, because it says proposed. So I'm just trying to understand, is that proposed 2040 comp plan or?
Yeah, so that is the proposed. I will say that there's not really a whole lot of difference between the two when you look at what the water supply needs are. It just barely kind of moves what those bars do, but that's something we could take a look at. If you wanted to look at it, we might have to spend some time to figure out exactly how many acres we're gaining or losing on certain land uses.
And that's fine, but that might be a point of for the next presentation that I certainly am interested in what it changes the water usage. Even if it's small, I need to know that before I vote on that comp plan. So that's probably for the next presentation, but since we're on it.
Sure. So that's a great one.
No other questions at this time?
All right. Well, then I'll go over a few more things that are involved in the dashboard here, and then we can jump into some scenarios. So there's a tab that we have that illustrates the acreage across our different land use categories for the 2 scenarios. And so this changes if you change the baseline land use map. And then you can also go in for either scenario A or scenario B and make specific adjustments to land use categories. So you could say, what happens if we took 1,000 acres of medium density residential and turned that into a mixed use neighborhood? What's the impact of that on water use? So there's A and B adjustments. We get the acreage plot and then the forecasting results plot, and that's everything that's in here. But there's quite a lot that you can see with all these different options.
So maybe
Councillor Namella has a question.
Just on those toggles, I mean, that example that you just provided, like changing medium density residential to commercial or mixed use, not really going to happen. We'd be looking at more commercial uses switching over to residential. So just to I think it would be helpful to have some basic parameters instead of just going hog wild over, woohoo, what can change? And really identifying how many acres of underutilized land we actually would have in the commercial and or non-residential categories, just to make this a little more realistic. And maybe, I mean, it sounds like Mr. Spurgeon already created some maps for you, but I would just caution on the, just playing around too much with the land use toggles like that.
Good point. Thank you, Councilor Nermella. Yeah, most of what we've done so far has been with the 4 preload scenarios. But yeah, we do have the option to step outside of those with different adjustments.
So maybe to get us started here, Taylor, if you want to move the risk back down to the 0. Yep. That way we're looking at kind of that minimum. And then just because this is just something to get us started, let's click the drought management plan so that we're assuming we're implementing drought management. So right now that water supply is how much water supply the system will produce. And both of those bars are showing the conservation trend continues from what we've been seeing. It continues to decline at that same rate. And it's showing that the proposed comp plan. So maybe let's for the scenario B, we can change proposed comp plan. Let's make it something like our super dense future. So that's the implication of having a much more dense land use map than what the comp plan shows. The converse side of that is you can switch it over and you can say, okay, what is the weak economy land use map? Which, Mayor Pro Tem, maybe I need to pick a different name there, but. So that really didn't change a whole lot in that from the business as usual. There weren't a ton of parcels for us to kind of pull out as undevelopable, but we can kind of dig into that if that's something you're interested in looking at. I'm sensing this is a lot. So if anyone has any specific questions, we can go from there.
Councilor Baker?
I don't understand the range. I mean, I understand minimum, low, and high, but what does that mean?
Right. So in each of the demand scenarios, we also have a wide range of potential results. There also are 1,000 demand futures for each of the demand scenarios. And the way that we get to those is within each land use category, we resample out of the existing population. And what that looks like is you would take, for instance, medium density residential existing accounts and figure out what their water use normalized by land area is, so that acre foot per acre for the individual existing user. And then you apply the distribution to the future land use map. So it comes up with, under a specific set of land use assumptions and also conservation assumptions, a probabilistic distribution of future demands.
So maybe I could summarize that. We know that any specific land use, any specific parcel is going to have a potential range of water need. It's going to depend on like what is actually built there. It's going to depend on landscaping, how many fixtures are in the facility. There's all these variables that can happen inside and still be compliant within a land use type. And so we can't necessarily say that there's going to be a specific acre foot of usage on any given parcel. And Taylor does analysis to kind of show the full range of possible futures of what each of those land uses might need. And it's variable because we don't necessarily know what's going to be built there.
Okay, so this one has the water supply line at drought management. And the one previously had the water supply as it is now, right? Reliable minimum. So am I understanding these graphs correct? When we put the water supply at really reliable minimum, we don't have enough water for the growth.
Let's take a look
Why
at
don't you
it.
go ahead and put the water supply, there you go. So does that mean we don't have enough water for the growth we have planned?
There are futures looking at, let's look at the one on the left is business as usual and conservation trends continue. So in that case, there is potential that in 1 in 1,000 runs and maybe a little bit above that, we wouldn't have enough water. So you're kind of taking the extents of both of those, the very top demand that we could possibly see and the very bottom demand of water supply. And in that case, we would have water supply shortfall if we didn't implement drought restrictions and if we ended up on the extreme side of both of those scales.
So that means, okay, well, 1 in 1,000 is, yeah, we don't need to be that conservative, my goodness. But 750 out of 1,000, what would that look like? So I guess that'd be doing that line.
Well, and also just to be clear, it's when the top bar from the demand distribution exceeds the low end of the water supply, that's more like 1 in a million because it's 1,000 of each of the types of futures. But if we went up to, you were saying like a 25%? Is that?
Yeah, really one chance more that we'd run out of water.
So that's what the dotted line would be.
That's what the dashed line is illustrating there.
So then we have more than enough water, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you can use the slider to determine what that sort of crossover percentage is. If I just turn it down to where it matches. Yeah, that's.
So what are you doing there?
So now we're at 0.2%. The hydrologic risk. And that the difference there with such a small percentage illustrates that the tails of the distribution are kind of steep in this distribution, meaning that you have a larger difference between 0 and 1% than 1 and 2. It gets steeper at the end there.
So if we did 100 years, how many years would, well, in this one, even if we did 100 years, we'd never be short of water? Probabilistically.
Yeah, I think that, the length of these traces is sufficient that, I would say that you could extend it out to saying that it would last for 100 years. I mean, technically it's slightly less than 70 that we're running it for, but the problematic droughts really tend to occur on more of a 3 or a 4 year time frame. That's the kind of a drought that stresses the system.
Well, I mean, obviously there was a drought in 1954 and one in 2002. And both of those years we'd be short of water, wouldn't we?
Well, we would be able to make it through in those years due to the storage that we came in from wetter years beforehand.
So in like 1954 and 2002, when they happen again, we just draw water out of Stanley Lake.
That's the idea. And the concept with the drought management plan is that when we have started withdrawing The first stage talks about cutting back to 2 days a week of watering. It's a 30% outdoor reduction, which is pretty modest. And that's the way that we've structured it. That can't happen in more than 1 out of 3 years. And then there's a second stage that's more restrictive that we don't want to happen more than 1 in 10 years.
Gotcha. But I guess that gets me right back to my question is, how can we have 28,000 acre feet of water when we institute the drought management plan? Wouldn't we use less than the 23.4?
Are you asking if when the drought management plan is activated under the at 28,000?
Yeah, when the drought management plan is activated, aren't we doing that to use less than the 23.4?
The stage 1 restrictions end up being pretty, actually they're a little bit higher than the 23.4. It's a 30% outdoor reduction. And it's, only during the irrigation season. So it's not for the full year. So we are still getting more than the 23.4 in the stage 1 years.
Okay, I'm going to have to take extra training on this because frankly, I just don't understand what I'm looking at and how to interpret it.
I don't know if you have more for us tonight, but I know you've given us a lot to think about as we go to our next piece, which is the comprehensive land use plan, and knowing everything that we've heard here and all of your different scenarios. We should have an interesting discussion on the next topic. Did you need anything else from us tonight?
Mayor, I could offer, it would take us a week or so, but we could make this model available to City Council on an individual basis. And we could also do something similar, if it would be helpful, that we did when we were doing the water rate analyses with City Council, where we could have council members come in and we could go through the model in more detail and then leave it with you. So you would all have access to it. It's web-based. So that is an option for you that I wanted to put out.
Thanks. Anything else under this topic? Councilor Namella?
But just caution us to focus in on what our vision is of the community and then use this model to provide some sensitivity testing to help us calibrate that vision, but not to let this model lead our visioning.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much. And we hope everybody's feeling better, gets better, and doesn't get sick.
We will do our best. Thank you so much, Mayor.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
We need another 5-minute break. Okay, 2040 plan. Welcome.
Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, council members. Thanks for having us tonight. John McConnell, Interim Planning Manager, Andrew Spurgeon, Principal Planner for Long Range Planning. Tonight, we're going to give you a presentation to describe the purpose of the comprehensive plan, its relationship with other relative plans, and how it relates to the development review process. The presentation is really just intended to provide an informational overview for you to help you in future discussions, questions, and decision-making. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Andrew. Andrew has been working on this comprehensive plan for a few years now, and this has been his baby, and he is the most knowledgeable about this plan. And so between Andrew and I, we should be able to answer any questions that you have. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you, John. How's that audio? Is that okay?
Good.
Okay. Again, good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, councilors. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to talk about the comp plan at a foundational level discussion. We'll start off talking about our existing comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2013, and then review some of the recent trends over the last decade, and then introduce some of the concepts with the proposed update to the comprehensive plan. Tonight is really the first opportunity staff has had to visit with this city council about the comprehensive plan. So we do intend for tonight to be introductory in nature, providing an opportunity for you to identify what are the things or information desired to help better understand the plan before taking action on it at a potential later date. So obviously we're here in the room and we understand there's going to be a desire for some additional time on the water supply before moving forward. And so no formal action is requested tonight. Next slide, please. No. Yeah, if we could go to slide 2.
We're quick studies. They're eating popcorn back there. I just know.
Which slide didn't look right? Yeah, you can stop there. That's where we should be. Thank you. The purpose of the comprehensive plan is to enhance the city's vitality, identify and respect community character, and guide future municipal programming and services. This type of guidance is expressed through goals and policies such as topics of transportation, public health, utilities. The plan is long range in nature with a 20-year horizon, and so it is separate from more immediate operational type strategic planning that the city may be undertaking. As a long range plan, it also aligns with the Denver Regional Council of Governments, DRCOG, MetroVision, and thus helps the city's eligibility for funding opportunities. For example, the Sheridan Underpass project received over $5 million in funds from DRCOG. The city adopted its comprehensive land use plan in 1997 and then enacted a revised plan in 2004. We currently use the 2013 comprehensive plan, which is really a unique document because it departed from the more singular focus of land use that's in the earlier plans and really looked more broadly at the related topics such as transportation, economic vitality, parks, recreation, utilities, public safety, to be truly comprehensive in nature. The 2013 plan accounted for development of all vacant private property in the city and coordinated this with the city's finite resources using the tools available at the time. Compliance with the plan is mandatory for new development. This is something that is a bit unique to Westminster. A lot of jurisdictions only use their comprehensive plan more as an advisory or guiding type document and do not require strict compliance with the plan. I know John and I sometimes get referrals from some of our neighboring jurisdictions, and it's interesting what some of their staffs determine as being compliant with their comprehensive plans. So not quite as strict to the letter as Westminster has. The plan is truly a fundamental reference document that we use when we're pursuing grant opportunities or when staff is approached by potential developers asking about land uses on a particular site. Next slide, please. A certain extent of amendments to the comprehensive plan are to be expected, both due to the mandatory nature of the mandatory compliance provision, but also the plan is anticipated to be a living document that changes with the community over time. City Council established criteria for evaluating comprehensive plan amendments in 2018. Prior to this 2018 ordinance, the criteria was in the public good, was what the code actually said. We found this a bit subjective, and so the enactment of the more specific criteria in 2018 really helped staff evaluate things such as compatibility with surrounding neighborhoods, water supply impact, and those type of things. Since the enactment of those criteria, there have been both smaller in size and fewer in number comprehensive plan amendments, as shown on this slide. This table shows the aggregated number of amendments per year, their combined acreages, and the cumulative water supply impact. For example, you'll see in 2019, there were 2 comprehensive plan amendments approved by City Council. One was non-residential in nature for property at 108th and Wadsworth Parkway, 7.8 acres that went from retail commercial to flex light industrial. The second, later in 2019, was the St. Mark's Village development at the northwest corner of 97th Avenue and Federal Boulevard, changing 10.7 acres from mixed use to retail commercial for the portion that's the Wishbone Restaurant, to R36 for the 6 acres that is multifamily, and to public, quasi-public for the site for the expanded hydropillar facility where the self-storage used to be located. This amendment history is further detailed in attachment 2 to the agenda memo. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to change gears here and talk about population and recent trends. Next slide. There we go. Thank you. Since the infrastructure challenges that the city faced in the 1970s, and specifically at that time a limit on sewer treatment capacity, the city has managed growth through what are called service commitments. Specifically, water resources are calculated in terms of service commitments. Sometimes you'll see the SC abbreviation. One service commitment is equivalent to 140,000 gallons of annual use. Multiples of service commitments are purchased based on projected volume of water use for a project or individual development. Sales of service commitments, as you can see, remained very strong through the 2000s until the Great Recession in 2008, after which the sale has been relatively low other than in year 2016. Since 2017, the number of service commitments sold has remained well below the pre-recession levels, and year 2021 was particularly low for the sale of service commitments. Next slide, please. A scan of permitting trends from 2010 to 2021 illustrate that 2019 was a peak year for residential permitting activity, and the number permitted since then has been falling, as shown in attachment 6. The spike in multifamily permitting in 2019 results from specific actions taken by prior city councils that enabled 5 different multifamily projects at that time, comprehensive plan amendments, PDP amendments, and other actions taken by city council that approved those. I would note that the 2020 figure actually includes the replacement of the 67 units at the Westbury apartments that burned down in a well-publicized fire a few years ago. Next slide, please. As the city nears build out, the remaining land inventory continues to shrink. And this is shown in a little more detail in attachment 7. Currently, there's about 1,026 acres or 4.7% of the city's land area that is vacant developable land. However, if you remove those lands that have active development applications in our system already. The amount of vacant developable land drops to about 569 acres, or 2.6% of the city's land area. Vacant developable land does not include our open spaces, which are an additional 15% of the city's land area, or other sites that are undevelopable, such as rights of way. Next slide, please. All right, with this, we're going to transition to talking a little bit more about the comprehensive plan update. First, just to hit it off, that staff places a high value on community engagement, and therefore we sought out to provide many opportunities for participation in this effort, frankly, more than the city has done with any other comprehensive planning efforts. We had planned specific events as well as larger community events such as Harvest Fest and Movies in the Park, as well as online surveys, 8 visits with 3 different city councils, and with tonight a 9th presentation to a 4th city council. And to facilitate inclusive engagement, we had translation services available, English and Spanish, and Hmong on request. We sought out specific groups such as the Youth Advisory Panel, the Hmong Community Latino Festival, Westminster Chamber of Commerce, and we even created some meeting in a box options for people to host meetings in their own homes, particularly as we got into COVID. At the larger events such as Harvest Festival or Movies in the Park, our main goal was just to get the word out. We'd pass out postcards that directed people to text polling and online surveys, as well as our website. We did have a lot of good online participation even before the pandemic, going back into 2019. We calculated that we engaged with approximately 77,000 people through this process. Staff is certainly happy to do additional community engagement if that's something City Council desires. Next slide, please.
Could I ask a couple quick questions on this, Andrew?
Sure.
On the, if you go back one slide, please. I'm looking at the participants. So
Right.
with the 2013, they had the progressive HOA and South Westminster plan. So were those same groups part of the new one? Because I don't see them in the other one, but I'm not assuming that means they weren't interviewed for the newer comp plan.
They were not. They did not request specific meetings. I do know that they were on our mailing list. I do know they were on there.
Okay, and then on the down lower, the interviews is the one area where it looks like there was more in 2013 versus
That's right.
20, the newer one. Who were those interviews with?
It was with a variety of people. It was with all of the prior city councilors at that time, property owners, community stakeholders. Probably get that list for you. I think it's right inside the jacket of the plan.
I can look if that's where it is.
Yeah. The full list is on Roman numeral 3.
Okay.
Some staff, external stakeholders.
And I'm just, so then it's potential that the newer interviewers, maybe some of those folks weren't available any longer to participate, or like when you're going into the newer ones, we tried to reach out to the same people wherever possible, I'm assuming.
It was, and I guess the way I looked at it, the interviews were sort of primarily done early in the process. It helped us kind of identify issues that we used for the broader engagement to help us have some focus.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Could you, you may have said this in the presentation, but I was taking notes. Go figure. What is the time frame that was part of these outreach? Was it 2019? Was it 2020?
Sure.
Was it?
There was a lot of thought into timing, actually. We started the comp plan effort actually in the summer of 2018. There were a few events, but the outreach was a little more limited. There were some other things going on in the community at that time. For example, the Water 2025 group was meeting. And so there was some concern from city management about we don't want to confuse or overwhelm our citizens. So we purposely did the bulk of the outreach in 2019, primarily the summer and fall, working around the city's event schedule that was prior to COVID. So we still had those large events like Movies in the Park, we could go out and meet people instead of having them come to us. So that was the bulk of our in-person events was in 2019. Moving into 2020, particularly that early part of 2020 when things were restricted, is when we started doing more online, and we offered the meeting in the box for people to meet at home, and then kind of brought that all together to form the plan.
Thank you so much.
When they did online, can they do it more than once, or did you have stop gaps so that they could, with 77,000 people responding?
We have a way of checking the individual IP addresses of responses, so we can filter out dupes. I believe the occurrence of that was pretty rare, though. And that wasn't 77,000 online responses. That was just total community interactions. I will pick up then on the next slide from what's on the screen here. This slide is a little confusing, but all that we're trying to show here is sort of the general phases of development of the plan. And as just mentioned, we wrapped up the 2019 engagement, the Taste of Westminster event in November 2019, and we started developing the first draft plan. And we were trucking along really with a lot of positive momentum, and then COVID hit. And obviously that was a big deal, particularly in the early days. You know, we as a city were getting our arms around what it meant, how long it was going to last, how bad it was. So we really sort of paused work at that point to allow City Council to focus on some of the more immediate concerns. Meanwhile, this also gave staff some time to sort of revisit some of the content. Does it still make sense? Are there things that we didn't think about, such as, you know, some of the early days of the pandemic, you know, food access was an issue. So some of these issues during this sort of pause and progress on the plan is also when the city's vision statement changed, specifically dropping the next urban center phrase. So that gave us time to think about that, digest what it meant. And so the prior vision statement that with that change was, we are a thriving community of safe neighborhoods and beautiful open space that is sustainable and inclusive. And so the two published drafts of the plan that came out in 2021 were using that version of the vision. So they were already after removal of the next urban center. However, they obviously did not yet incorporate the more recent vision change that this city council has embraced. And so it would be helpful if council would help us understand if there's a belief that we're aligning with that, or if there's further changes that need to be made to achieve that alignment. Next slide, please. This slide shows the organization of the plan. Each of the plan's chapters begins with sort of an overview narrative and then identifies a series of goals and policies. The cross-cutting topics of education, equity, health, resilience, safety, and climate are peppered throughout each chapter. Very similar to the sustainability plan, if you've looked at that document. Land use is one policy within the greater document, but really needs to be considered with other content such as housing, economic resiliency, public health, and resource conservation. Next slide, please. First, I want to note that the 2013 comprehensive plan is a very robust plan. As I mentioned, it was the first really interdisciplinary plan the city's done, and it's been very enduring over time. And for that reason, a lot of the policies in the current plan are carried over. About 95 policies of the 161 in the proposed plan come from the existing comprehensive plan. The plan updates really incorporates a paradigm shift away from the heavy focus on new development, and instead promotes our existing neighborhoods and what can be done to ensure sustainable neighborhoods moving into the future, and thinking about that revised vision statement, looking at our neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are aging. How can we support homeowner associations and other activities to ensure coordination of neighborhood services? The plan introduces concepts for wellness and healthy living. For example, policies to support local food access to healthy foods, and the type of amenity spaces included with residential development. For example, opportunities for community agriculture. The economic resilience chapter has some of the most differences as compared to the existing comprehensive plan, really departing from the recruitment and retention type approach to economic development and thinking more holistically about workforce development, the creation of amenity-laden environments that employers are seeking, and support for smaller local businesses. The plan includes strategies to address financial resiliency in future years and a fiscal evaluation of the land use element, which showed a revenue positive outcome over the next 20 years. To ensure the continued relevancy of the proposed plan into the future, we're proposing a couple of additions: a biennial reporting process to assess plan progress and report back to council and identify where adjustments may be needed, and separately an implementation action plan, which is included in attachment 15. That's proposed to be housed outside the plan due to the frequency of the updates and the need for it to be flexible based on budgeting, immediate council priorities that may come up year to year, staff capacity, and other external variables. These are key changes from the existing comprehensive plan, though. Next slide, please. Land use and development is just one of the 5 chapters with goal and policy content, but based on the inquiries we've received, we understand it's of great interest to council. The predominant land uses incorporated in the proposed plan are parks, golf courses, and open space, accounting for 40% of the city's land area. This is followed by lower density residential uses that comprise about 29% of the city's land area. At the far end of the spectrum are the land uses that occur the least often in the highest densities, such as mixed-use activity center, specific plan, which are only 2%, or multifamily, which are only 4% of the city's land area. Next slide, please. The 2040 plan and the city's prior comprehensive plans anticipate build out of the city. Again, it assumes that all vacant private lands are developed and that there's some degree of redevelopment included there. This population projection is based on assumptions about how land use will develop over time and functions solely as an exercise to understand the impacts of the plan. The projection is not a cap on growth, nor is it a desire to reach that level of growth. It's more about what will happen if we build out this plan and can we support that. The projection is actually a slight decrease from what was projected under the existing comprehensive plan that's in place now. As shown in the upper right, the city's past comprehensive plans also distinguish unit types as a function of the land use map. So the proposed plan update increases the ratio of single family development relative to the amount of multifamily expected through build out. The table at the bottom of the slide shows the anticipated build out of some of our nearby communities who typically have growth rates much more aggressive than what we anticipate in Westminster. With the city substantially built out, there simply is not a lot of land left for extensive population growth, even if the comprehensive plan included more aggressive land use changes. Hence, the plan's changed focus with the revised vision statement to better support existing neighborhoods and business districts, and looking at services and programming to support the needs of the city 20 years out, such as the aging population. With the reduced focus on new growth, the fiscal impact evaluation of the plan identified an estimated savings of $35 million over the life of the plan. Next slide, please. This is the final slide that sort of recaps the key points. Similar to the sustainability plan, the 2040 comprehensive plan is a high-level citywide policy document. It's long-range in nature to support the needs of the community expected over the next 20 years. The plan results from priorities identified in stakeholder interviews and community engagement with thousands of residents and has been refined based on feedback of those who submitted comments on that final draft last year. The plan increases the focus on neighborhood planning and the character of development, really looking beyond parcel by parcel. Land use is one policy within the overall plan framework and has been tested with water, subject to additional discussions, which we understand need to happen, and has been evaluated for fiscal impacts at a citywide scale. In support of the revised vision statement, the comprehensive plan recognizes that existing neighborhoods become a more central focus as the city nears build out. Next slide, please. We've heard Council's desire to have a better understanding of water supply and the associated assumptions with water supply planning. Once City Council is comfortable with water, then direction on the comprehensive plan will be requested at a later date. Next slide, please. This concludes my presentation. It's been a high-level introduction to what is really a large, lengthy document, you might say comprehensive plan. We look forward to receiving feedback from City Council on what additional information or action is requested to be brought forward at a later time to ensure that there's a well thought out document that aligns with the vision statement. Thank you.
Questions? Comments? Mayor Pro Tem?
Just in case anybody skips through the presentations tonight, I had a question earlier that I know you captured, which is to be able to justify whatever changes the comprehensive 2040 plan is compared to the 2013 as far as water supply. So
noted.
Just in case anybody decided to listen to just this portion, that's an outstanding thing that they're going to return to us.
Definitely.
Councilor Baker?
I think you covered this, but refresh my memory why we changed the names of the thing. Just as you get used to one set of rules, there's a new set of rules.
I know, isn't that great when government does that?
It's like teaching. Yikes.
Certainly, and it was certainly not the intention to create confusion. When you look at the proposed plan, one of the guiding principles is to create great neighborhoods. And in doing so, what we were trying to do was refocus the land use discussion from that parcel by parcel view to really thinking of the character of development at a neighborhood scale and how do we ensure a certain character of neighborhood is maintained across multiple parcels. And so rather than focusing as much on individual land uses, we were really looking at the overall look and feel of an area. Is it low density? Is it high density? Is it suburban? Is it urban? And we thought this would actually help create understanding, but I could certainly understand why there could be confusion. In doing so, we did refine the categories. We still have a fairly high degree of granularity with our land uses. We have 19 different types. Looking at Arvada, Aurora, Broomfield, Centennial, Fort Collins, Lakewood, Longmont, Thornton, none of them have anywhere near that number of land use types. So we still have a fairly high degree of granularity, but we did change some of the names. That was something we actually worked with the Planning Commission on, and they were supportive of that change.
Thank you.
Okay. With the land use designations, it would work well if we had really strong design guidelines that establish those character types and deep descriptions of those character types, but we don't. So then we go into just more broad use categories that don't necessarily guarantee that something will fit in the context of the surrounding community. So I think that's what I'm missing with the change in the land use designations. So I'll have more specific comments as we get into them, because I think what I'm just trying to figure out is just what small calibrations can we make to they've been thought out, but I'm just trying to think of things that do impact neighborhoods, lighting, traffic, certain types of uses that impact residential and other sensitive uses. So those are, that's just like a little layering and adjustment I would ask for.
Sure. And we anticipated updated design standards, both to be updated, but also to address a more wider range of occurrences in the community. For example, we don't have standards for office or industrial, and the standards are not well calibrated to small infill type sites. So We have a development code project as a companion project. They've sort of gotten separated now. The code project, frankly, is complicated. I don't know how to say it any other way. It's complicated. And staff was not very happy with the performance of the consultant we were working with. We let them go a while back. But we really wanted to focus on finishing up the comp plan before picking that up to make sure we were getting the feedback from council really on what that vision is before we spend a lot more money.
And so the comprehensive plan, as Andrew noted, has an implementation plan. And so codes and design standards are part of that implementation plan. In our view, it's very important to get a comprehensive plan finalized and adopted, and then go into the implementation to make sure that we're implementing what that plan says.
For me, it was difficult to read. There's a ton in there for 85 pieces of land. And when you look at where we have everything built out in these pieces around, to me, we need to be looking at 30,000 foot level, even 3,000 foot level, and look at what's missing for that area. If there's commercial, if there's residential, if there's multi-housing, what else is missing within that area that is needed for people not to have to drive from 73rd up to 144th? We know we have food deserts. We know we need medical. We know, I don't know what's going on between 128th and 144th in the land up there. I know when I left in 13, we had thought if we were having office buildings, medical things, any of those issues, that's where you put those because it doesn't matter how high you go. It's a highway you're blocking from the residents up there. I have no idea because I see some of the things that say things are under review. I have no clue what those green things are. So I have no clue. I can't evaluate and tell you what I think because I don't know. But for me, it's looking at each of these pieces now because they are pieces and looking at the whole that's there and saying what's missing. What do they need? What trails need to be connected to? What are the bike paths? What are the parks that people can get to? The transportation issues. We know RTD's been decreasing transportation. So what do we need to advocate for? We have to me, a huge missing piece in everything is house prices. We need variable house prices so anyone can purchase, and it may look like a condo. I don't really care, but people deserve to be able to purchase, and that includes our senior citizens. Just because they're downsizing, and I know we just opened Dominium, but they're rentals. These people have owned homes. They want to downsize. Where are they able to go? Covenant Village is full, has a waiting list. What resources do we have for seniors to keep them in our city? And out of everything, as we heard from the two presentations before you, whatever we do with you has to work with water or we don't build it. Councilor Baker?
Yeah, I've also identified 6 really projects that I think we have the wrong call on. Okay, so I don't know when we bring those into the process.
Yeah, if we go on here and we could at least figure out if it's a comp plan or another forum that we discuss those.
Okay, and this intersects with the water because I think the designations on these will have a raised water appetite.
Councilor Baker, are you referring maybe to this map? Great.
You want me to just go ahead and cite them?
Please.
13, changing from Office R&D low density to medium residential density. The water appetite went up double at least. 16, again, office R&D low density to residential medium density, double appetite. 35, I think we got the wrong call on this originally, and I'd like to revisit it. I don't think this is a mixed-use center or a mixed-use activity center. And a mixed-use activity center has an enormous appetite. And 84, mixed-use neighborhood from traditional mixed-use neighborhood. And when you talk about the neighborhoods, I think this would be completely out of step with the neighborhood in Westminster. To the north of it, to the east of it, and to the west of it is just office and business and stuff like that. So those are the 6 that I'd like to review. There are some other ones, but because they're such small size, I thought it not be a good use of our time. And even though they might increase their appetite, if it's only 0.6 acres, that's not going to be much water.
Councilor Baker, you said 6. I only took down 4. I have number 13, 16,
Well, because I
35.
put 2 circles on 35. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, there's 2 on 35.
13, 16 had 2 circles. 35 had 2 circles. And 84.
Okay. And so it sounds like, Councilor Baker, your comment really does tie back to Mayor McNally's comment.
Absolutely.
Let's focus on the
Water
vacant,
appetite.
undeveloped, and unassigned properties. Right. Unassigned meaning not in process, they're entitled.
And I think I know what at least 3 of the big green properties are. So.
Yes.
Because this council did 2 of them.
Yes. And 2, I'll suggest that if any of the council members want to maybe at a different time sit down with any of us or either of us and go through these where you might have more questions about what's going on in more detail, I can provide that to you as well.
Quick question for you. In between 1, 2, and 3, there's a green parcel. What is that development? Can you remind me?
2. That's the property we call Foster Farm. They have a PDP currently under review. It's a 80-acre site around the Lowe's up at 136.
Okay.
That is actually it's all non-residential. It's retail and office type of land uses, but it is something that actually will require a council approval.
Okay. Thank you. We were trying to figure out what it was. We weren't sure.
I have a process question. So back in, I guess it was 2013, when we were proposing changes in land use to each individual property, we did go back and notify every property owner that we're potentially changing use and allow them the opportunity to weigh in or let them know, hey, this is the process, this is the timing. And we certainly did hear from some more significant property owners who then came to council and asked for a change. So with some of these parcels just identified by Councilor Baker, for example, those were some of the ones that had come back in and asked for the specific land use category that they had. So I just wanted to, one, kind of, I think a few people, I know the mayor was on council at that time, but may or may not remember, but that process-wise, we should just acknowledge that there will be that additional community outreach, more focused outreach if we do start to change uses.
Yeah, I guess I'd say a couple of things, and I'll let you weigh in well if you want. But we did, one Well, just starting, as we were having community conversations about the plan, we had certain property owners that were already coming out and expressing their opinions one way or another. We do have a few property owners who very specifically requested land use changes, and those are included in the attachment 12, the comments received. There were other places where land use changes were identified by staff, and we did contact those. We did not always get a response, but we did make an effort to contact those through the mail. And I even dropped by a dentist's office that I was trying to get a hold of, and they didn't really seem to want to talk to me, but we tried. I guess I would also say that we really sort of paused any additional community outreach pending further discussion with City Council. So if council should move towards adopting some version of the plan, then yes, we would do additional notification.
Would we not have a, so if we do make changes, whether they're small or large, we would have a public review round?
I think we would have to. In fact, we would have to, at a minimum, go back to the Planning Commission. Therefore, I think we would want to go an additional step back for some sort of additional community outreach on that.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Thank you for being here tonight. Interim City Manager Andrews. Things I've heard tonight that might help us is you have a council that wasn't, some of us weren't here in 19 to know what the conservation plan is written somewhere in some of these documents. If that could be forwarded to us to read, if we have questions, then we can bring them up. But also in any of the 2018 water plan, that was September, I think 18th, that was a massive document. And if we're still going by that whole document that was passed, we may need to look at that to see if there's anything that we want changed. It might help with some of the things that we heard tonight and maybe don't want to vote on until we know what we're really voting on, because there's some hidden pieces down there that we don't necessarily know and would be good. Anything else for the good of the order? Oh, Mayor Pro Tem.
We're just going to also bring up with the drought management plan, one of the reasons initially I voted against it, and there was some changes after the fact that I voted in favor of that were, in my mind, good. I don't remember what those were, but as people read through the documents, my big objection to the drought management was actually the authority that it gave to the city manager specifically that used to belong to council. And that's around when a drought is declared. So it would be, I'm gonna have to look back at it myself and kind of figure out what the triggers are that would then allow the city manager to declare that drought. But just as a point of clarification, because I know, Mayor, when you were here before, it would have been up to council to do it. And that was a big objection I had to that document.
Anything else? Thank you all for, oh, Councilor Namela.
I was just going to say thank you to staff for all of the presentations tonight. And it's really evident just how much work has gone into these documents and processes over the past few years. And they are really exemplary. And so I just wanted to say that.
It's just hard. You have a new audience. And so we need to be up to date so we know what we're voting on. Thanks.
Mayor, thank you. And thank you for the recap and Mayor Pro Tem as well. So we will reconvene it with staff and we'll go through tonight and the discussions, and we will make sure that we come back with information and also perhaps a follow-up study session before we seek any direction from you. Make sure that we are addressing those missing pieces and those gaps. And tonight was extremely helpful in terms of understanding where your questions are coming from and the information that you're seeking. So thank you for that. We will reconvene with staff and put that together. With your indulgence, I would like to recognize Mr. Andrew Spurgeon. Tonight was his last night presenting to City Council. He's moving on in his career, and I wanted to acknowledge his contributions to the City of Westminster, to the comprehensive plan work. You've probably noticed that Mr. Spurgeon is unflappable. He's hyper responsive. He's innovative, dedicated, talented, and a consummate professional. And we will miss him immensely on our staff team and his contributions. So, Mr. Spurgeon, thank you for all you've done for the city.
Thank you and good luck. All right, with that, it is 10:24 and we are out of here. Just to make sure that if anybody's listening and you think we have an executive session that was canceled as we came down from dinner tonight, we did not need it. So thank you.